That romantic piano music you hear in Western movies? Real saloon pianists were actually paid to do something far more sinister than entertain customers. What they really did would shock you. The year was 1822, and somewhere in the rugged wilderness of Wyoming, history was about to get a whole lot more interesting. A small, ramshackle building appeared at a place called Brown's Hole, and with it came the birth of something that would define the American frontier for generations. This wasn't just any building, this was the very first Western saloon. Brown's Hole sat in a remote valley, where fur trappers gathered to trade pelts and swap stories. These weren't your typical businessmen in fancy suits. We're talking about rough, weathered men who spent months alone in the mountains, wrestling with bears and dodging hostile tribes. When they finally made it back to civilization, they had one thing on their minds: a stiff drink and some human company. The saloon itself? Well, calling it a building might be generous. Most early saloons were nothing more than canvas tents or lean-to structures cobbled together from whatever materials happened to be lying around. Forget about fancy architecture or comfortable seating. These places were about as basic as it gets. A few wooden planks for a bar, maybe some tree stumps for chairs, and a barrel or two of questionable whiskey. But here's the thing about frontier towns. When pioneers rolled into a new territory, they had priorities. Food, shelter, and protection topped the list, sure. But right behind those essentials came the need for a place to gather, drink, and blow off steam. That's why saloons often became among the very first permanent structures in newly established settlements. The timing wasn't coincidental either. As wagon trains pushed further west and trading posts sprouted up along major routes, entrepreneurs quickly figured out that thirsty travelers represented serious money. A simple tent with a few bottles of liquor could turn a decent profit faster than most other businesses. All you needed was a supply of alcohol, and the guts to serve it to some pretty rough customers. For the first couple of decades after that Wyoming saloon opened, these establishments remained relatively rare. You might find one or two in the bigger trading posts, but most frontier communities made do without them. The populations were simply too small and scattered to support a dedicated drinking establishment. Families often made their own alcohol at home, and social gatherings happened in churches or private homes. The early saloon owners faced unique challenges that would make modern business owners break out in cold sweats. Supply chains. Forget about it. Getting whiskey to remote locations meant hauling barrels across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. Quality control was basically non-existent. Customers complained about watered-down drinks at their own risk, and don't even think about health inspections or business licenses. What's fascinating is how quickly these rough establishments became community centers. Sure, they served alcohol, but they also functioned as unofficial meeting halls, post offices, and news centers. A traveler might stop by to wet his whistle and end up learning about job opportunities, local dangers, or the latest political developments. Information flowed as freely as the whiskey, though both could be equally unreliable. The clientele in these early years consisted mainly of fur trappers, traders, and the occasional soldier or government official. Cowboys wouldn't become regular customers until cattle ranching expanded later in the century. But even this limited customer base created a unique social dynamic. Men who spent months in isolation suddenly found themselves rubbing shoulders with strangers from completely different backgrounds. Violence? Well, let's just say these weren't exactly refined gentlemen's clubs. When you mix alcohol, isolation, and men carrying weapons, things can get heated pretty quickly. But the legendary gunfights and bar brawls that Hollywood loves so much were still relatively uncommon in these early days. Most conflicts got settled with fists rather than firearms, mainly because bullets were expensive and hard to replace. The financial side of running an early saloon was surprisingly straightforward. Buy whiskey cheap, sell it expensive, and hope your customers paid their tabs before drinking themselves unconscious. Credit systems were informal but surprisingly effective. A man's reputation in a small frontier community meant everything, and welching on a bar tab could get you banned from the only entertainment for hundreds of miles. Weather played a huge role in business patterns. Spring brought fur trappers down from the mountains with full purses and months of stored-up social needs. Summer meant increased traffic from wagon trains and trading expeditions. Winter often forced saloons to close entirely, or operate with skeleton crews serving only local residents. But these humble beginnings were just the opening act. The real explosion in saloon culture was still decades away, waiting for events that would transform the entire character of the American West. Something big was coming that would turn every frontier settlement into a potential boomtown overnight. And when that happened, the demand for liquid courage would skyrocket beyond anything those early Wyoming trappers could have imagined. The year 1848 changed everything. News of gold in California spread like wildfire, and suddenly every dreamer, drifter, and desperate soul in America was heading west. What nobody expected was how thirsty all these fortune hunters would be. San Francisco exploded from a sleepy village of 800 people to a bustling city of 25,000 in just 2 years. The saloons couldn't keep up. Where there had been maybe 3 or 4 drinking establishments, suddenly dozens popped up practically overnight. Some entrepreneurs didn't even wait for proper buildings. They'd throw up a canvas tent, stock it with barrels of whiskey and call it a day. But here's the crazy part. The ratio made absolutely no sense by normal standards. A typical frontier town might have 1 saloon for every few hundred residents. These gold rush boomtowns, they'd have 30 saloons serving maybe 400 people. That's 1 bar for every 13 residents, including the women and children who weren't even allowed inside most of them. The math gets even wilder when you realize who was doing all this drinking. Miners worked brutal 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions. Cowboys rode into town after weeks on dusty trails. Soldiers stationed at remote outposts got occasional leave. These weren't casual social drinkers. They were men who drank like their lives depended on it. Probably because emotionally they did. Every new gold strike meant another instant town, and every instant town meant another rush of saloon openings. Virginia City, Nevada saw its first saloon open before they'd even built a proper main street. Deadwood, South Dakota had gambling halls and drinking establishments operating out of hastily constructed shacks while people were still sleeping in tents. The priorities were crystal clear. Then there's the business side that most people don't think about. Opening a saloon required almost no special skills and very little startup money. You needed some booze, a few tables, maybe some cards for gambling. Compare that to starting a general store, which required massive inventory, or a blacksmith shop, which needed expensive tools and years of training. Any guy with $50 and questionable judgment could hang out a shingle as a saloon keeper. The competition got fierce fast. Towns that mushroomed from nothing to thousands of residents in months created opportunities that disappeared just as quickly. Smart saloon owners knew they had to grab customers immediately or lose them to the joint across the muddy street. Some stayed open 24 hours, others hired piano players or brought in dancing girls from San Francisco. A few even offered free lunches, figuring they'd make up the cost in liquor sales. What's fascinating is how different these gold rush saloons were from the earlier frontier establishments. Those first Wyoming drinking spots served fur trappers who might visit twice a year. Gold Rush saloons had regular customers who showed up every single night. The business model completely changed. Instead of occasional big spenders, saloon owners now dealt with steady streams of tired, frustrated men looking to forget their troubles. The rush mentality affected everything about how these places operated. In older, established towns, saloons developed reputations over years. In boom towns, you might have 3 different owners in 6 months. Buildings got thrown up so fast that floors weren't level and roofs leaked. Nobody cared. If this gold strike played out, they'd all move to the next one anyway. Soldiers added another layer to the chaos. Army posts near mining areas meant regular payday crowds. These weren't random drifters, they were organized groups with steady income and strict schedules. Smart saloon owners learned to stock up before the monthly payroll arrived and brace for the wildest nights of their lives. The speed of it all created some bizarre situations. Towns would have elaborate saloons with imported mirrors and brass fixtures sitting next to competitors that were literally just planks laid across whiskey barrels. Customers might find themselves drinking expensive imported wine in a place with dirt floors and canvas walls. The gold rush created instant wealth alongside desperate poverty, sometimes in the same room. Cowboys presented their own challenges and opportunities. They'd hit town after months on cattle drives with serious money burning holes in their pockets. But they were also famously particular about their drinking establishments. A saloon that catered well to miners might completely fail to attract cowboy business, and vice versa. The pattern repeated itself across the West with remarkable consistency. Gold discovered, town explodes, saloons multiply like rabbits, money flows like water. Then either the gold ran out and the town died, or it grew into something more permanent and the saloon business stabilized. Of course, all this rapid expansion and easy money attracted some interesting characters to the saloon business. When anyone could open a bar and fortunes could be made overnight, you can imagine the kinds of people who showed up ready to serve drinks. Some of these saloon owners would become legends themselves, though not always for reasons they'd be proud of. When you walked into a frontier town, you didn't just stumble across Joe's Bar or the Tavern. These places had names that could stop you dead in your tracks. Saloon owners knew something modern marketers are still figuring out: a wild name gets attention, and attention brings customers through those swinging doors. Bughouse was what locals called the roadiest joints. Makes sense, right? These places buzzed with so much chaos that they resembled insect colonies. Gin mills ground out cheap liquor, like flour mills ground wheat. The names weren't fancy, but they told you exactly what you were walking into. Then there were the establishments that took themselves a bit more seriously. The White Elephant became such a popular saloon name across the West that it spawned an entire family of copycats. Once the White Elephant in one town made a reputation, suddenly every other settlement had a Black Elephant, Red Elephant, or Golden Elephant. Saloon owners weren't known for their creativity, but they sure knew how to spot a winning formula. The Oriental showed up in dozens of frontier towns. Owners thought it sounded mysterious and exotic, which was about as worldly as most of these places got. Keep in mind, these weren't exactly sophisticated establishments. They just wanted names that sounded like they belonged somewhere more exciting than a dusty street in the middle of nowhere. But the real gems were the saloons with names that practically dared you to walk inside. The Bucket of Blood didn't get its name from serving cranberry juice. The Last Chance told you everything about both the town's location and your odds of making it out in one piece. These weren't marketing gimmicks, they were honest advertising. Hell's Half Acre and the Devil's Den made sure everyone knew these weren't places for Sunday school teachers. Saloon owners understood their customer base perfectly. Rough men doing dangerous work wanted to drink in places that matched their lifestyle. A saloon called the Lily Pad wouldn't have lasted a week. Some names came from pure frontier humor. The hole in the wall didn't mean the building was falling apart, though it might have been. It meant this was where you went when you wanted to disappear for a while. Road to Ruin told customers exactly where they were headed, but they bellied up to the bar anyway. The weird part is how these names spread faster than gossip in a small town. A successful saloon name in California might show up in Montana 6 months later. News traveled slowly, but good saloon names moved like wildfire. Entrepreneurs heading west carried mental lists of names that worked. Peacock Alley and Crystal Palace represented the other end of the spectrum. These names promised something fancier than sawdust floors and rock gut whiskey. They suggested velvet curtains, actual glassware, and maybe even a piano that stayed in tune. Whether they delivered on these promises was another story entirely. Well, not every name was about intimidation or false elegance. Some saloon owners went for pure entertainment value. The Keno House told gamblers where to find their favorite game. The Mint suggested this was where money changed hands, which wasn't exactly false advertising in a gambling hall. Local geography inspired plenty of names too. The Nugget worked perfectly in gold rush towns. Cow Palace made sense in cattle country. Railroad House popped up wherever the tracks ran. These names connected the saloon to the local economy, making them feel like natural parts of the community. But here's what's fascinating. Some of these names have outlasted the buildings, the towns, and sometimes even the states they were in. Long Branch became so famous through stories and later television that people still recognize it today. The Silver Dollar name appears on bars across America, all tracing back to those original frontier watering holes. The most successful names combined multiple appeals. Lucky Strike suggested both mining prosperity and gambling fortune. Golden Horseshoe promised luck and hinted at the wealth that might change hands inside. These weren't random choices. Saloon owners thought carefully about what would draw the biggest crowds. Then there is the curious case of saloons that changed names more often than a traveling con man changed aliases. When business got slow, owners figured a new name might bring fresh customers. The same building might be the Maverick on Monday and the Frontier Palace by Friday. Names like these weren't just painted on wooden signs. They became part of American folklore. They represented freedom, danger, opportunity, and excess all rolled into one. Every name told a story about what the West promised, and what it often delivered instead. These colorful monikers were just the beginning of what made saloons unique, though. Once you pushed through those doors, the real character of these places became obvious in ways that went far beyond clever names. The glamorous saloons you see in movies. Forget everything you think you know. The first Western watering holes were about as fancy as a soggy cardboard box left in the rain. We're talking pure survival architecture here. Most early saloons started as canvas tents stretched over wooden poles. That's it. No walls, no floors, no fancy anything. Just a piece of cloth between you and the Wyoming wind, with maybe a wooden plank balanced on two barrels serving as the bar. Fur trappers didn't care if their drinking spot looked like a homeless camp. They just wanted somewhere to get drunk after months in the wilderness. But here's where things get interesting. The materials available in each location created wildly different saloon styles across the frontier. Mountain saloons often resembled rustic hunting lodges because, well, that's exactly what they were. Owners used whatever trees they could chop down, creating log structures that looked more like Lincoln's cabin than a proper drinking establishment. Some of these mountain bars were so cramped you had to duck to get through the door. Prairie saloons faced a different challenge entirely. No trees meant no logs. Many remained as canvas tents for years, flapping in the constant wind like drunken ghosts. The lucky ones managed to get their hands on wooden boards shipped in from distant sawmills, but those boards cost a fortune. One saloon owner in Nebraska reportedly paid more for his wooden floor than most people spent on an entire house. Then there's the dirt floor situation. This wasn't some charming rustic choice, it was pure necessity. Wooden floors were rare as hen's teeth in early frontier towns. Most saloon patrons spent their drinking hours standing on packed earth that turned into mud whenever someone spilled their whiskey. And trust me, people spilled their whiskey constantly. The floors became so disgusting that some owners started spreading sawdust around, creating what basically amounted to the world's first disposable carpeting. Desert saloons presented their own architectural nightmares. Adobe became the building material of choice, but early saloon builders had no clue how to properly mix mud and straw. Walls cracked in the heat, roofs leaked during rare rainstorms, and the whole structure sometimes just melted back into the ground during particularly wet seasons. One Arizona saloon collapsed 3 times in 2 years before the owner finally hired someone who actually knew what they were doing. The truly desperate situations created the most creative solutions. Some saloon owners in mining camps literally carved their establishments into hillsides, creating cave-like drinking dens that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. Others built their bars inside abandoned mine shafts, which sounds romantic until you realize these places were pitch black and filled with potentially explosive gas fumes. Drinking by candlelight takes on a whole new meaning when one spark could blow everyone to kingdom come. Let's not forget the coastal saloons, which faced their own unique problems. Salt air rotted wood faster than you could replace it. Many bar owners resorted to using driftwood and pieces of shipwrecks as building materials, creating establishments that looked like they'd been assembled by drunk pirates. Some of these coastal saloons were literally built on stilts to avoid high tide, swaying back and forth with every wave like a carnival ride designed by someone with a death wish. The really ambitious saloon owners tried to create something resembling civilization in these rough structures. They'd hang cheap paintings on canvas walls that rippled with every breeze. Mirrors became popular decorations, but most were so warped and cracked they made customers look like funhouse reflections. One saloon in Colorado became famous for its mirror that was actually just polished tin, giving everyone's face a distinctly greenish tint. But here's the weird part. These ramshackle establishments often outlasted the fancy buildings that came later. While proper hotels and banks crumbled during economic downturns, the humble tent saloons kept operating because they cost almost nothing to maintain. When business was good, owners might splurge on actual walls. When times got tough, back to canvas they went. The contrast between different saloon styles in the same town could be jarring. You might have a fancy 2-story wooden saloon on Main Street, complete with glass windows and painted signs, while just around the corner sat a tent bar that looked like it had been through a tornado. Both served the same rot-gut whiskey to the same desperate customers, but one charged twice as much because it had actual walls. Weather played havoc with these makeshift structures in ways that would make modern building inspectors faint. But these simple beginnings created something important. They proved that people would gather to drink no matter how awful the accommodations were. The furniture inside these early establishments tells an equally rough story about frontier priorities and survival. Walking into a typical frontier saloon meant stepping into a world designed for one thing: keeping men drinking as long as possible. The layout wasn't accidental. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, every corner had a purpose. The heart of any respectable saloon was its bar. Not just any bar, mind you, but a massive wooden beast that dominated the room like a ship's hull turned sideways. These weren't delicate pieces of furniture. They were built from whatever sturdy wood could be found locally. Pine in mountain towns, oak when available, sometimes even rough-hewn logs still showing axe marks. The bar stretched along one entire wall, sometimes 20 feet long or more. Why so big? Simple. More space meant more customers could belly up at once, and more customers meant more money flowing into the till. Behind that imposing bar stood rows of bottles, though calling them bottles might be generous. Many were just repurposed containers, old medicine bottles, mason jars, even cleaned out pickle containers. The fancier establishments displayed their whiskey in proper glass bottles, but frontier practicality usually won over appearances. What mattered was what went inside, not how it looked on the shelf. Then there's the famous brass foot rail that ran along the bottom of the bar. This wasn't just for show or comfort, though both mattered. That rail served a crucial purpose in saloons where men wore muddy boots and carried firearms. It gave customers a place to rest their feet while keeping their balance, which became increasingly important as the evening wore on and the whiskey took effect. Smart saloon owners learned that wobbly customers meant broken furniture and lost profits. Most saloons featured a large mirror mounted behind the bar, assuming the owner could afford one and get it transported without breaking. These mirrors weren't just vanity pieces. Bartenders used them to keep an eye on the entire room while mixing drinks. Gambling disputes, brewing fights, or suspicious characters, everything reflected back in that mirror. Plus, mirrors made the space look bigger and brighter, which helped when your establishment was basically a wooden box with small windows. Seating came in whatever form the owner could manage. Bar stools were luxury items on the frontier, so many customers simply stood at the bar. The lucky saloons had a few three-legged stools, 3 legs because four-legged furniture didn't work well on uneven dirt floors. Round tables scattered throughout the room served double duty for drinking and card games. Don't expect matching furniture sets. One table might be a proper round oak piece while another was just boards nailed to a barrel. The back section of most saloons belonged to gambling. This area needed special consideration because money changed hands there, and money attracted trouble. Poker tables were usually positioned where the dealer could see the front door. Nobody wanted to be surprised by angry losers or law enforcement. Faro tables required more elaborate setups with their betting layouts and card boxes. Some gambling areas were separated by a low railing or even a curtain, creating a sense of privacy that high-stakes players appreciated. Wall decorations varied wildly depending on the owner's taste and budget. Animal heads were popular: elk, deer, buffalo, or whatever local wildlife someone had shot. These trophies served as conversation starters and proof of frontier masculinity. Cheaper establishments might hang a few faded prints or newspaper clippings. Oil paintings occasionally graced the walls of more prosperous saloons, though subjects were usually limited to landscapes, patriotic scenes, or the occasional portrait of a prominent politician. Lighting presented constant challenges before electricity reached frontier towns. Most saloons relied on oil lamps and candles, creating dim, smoky environments that suited their rough clientele. Kerosene lamps hung from the ceiling or mounted on walls, casting flickering shadows that could hide both romantic encounters and criminal planning. The smell of burning oil mixed with tobacco smoke, spilled whiskey, and unwashed bodies to create the distinctive saloon atmosphere that old-timers remembered long after the frontier days ended. Floor covering was mostly wishful thinking. Sawdust scattered across dirt floors helped absorb spills and provided something soft to land on during fights. Wooden plank floors were genuine luxuries, and most saloon owners who managed to install them made sure everyone knew about this upgrade. Spittoons placed strategically around the room served necessary sanitary functions, though accuracy in hitting these targets declined as the evening progressed. Temperature control meant opening doors and windows in summer and feeding a pot-bellied stove in winter. The stove usually sat near the center of the room, radiating heat and serving as another gathering spot for conversation and card games during cold months. But even the most thoughtfully arranged saloon furniture couldn't prevent the chaos that made these establishments legendary. Speaking of chaos, the question of who actually owned these wild establishments reveals some surprising characters from frontier society. The Wild West had one simple rule for opening a saloon: if you had money, you were in business. No fancy degrees required, no background checks, no lengthy applications or interviews with town committees. Just cold hard cash and the guts to deal with whatever walked through your doors. Anyone could become a saloon owner overnight. Former lawmen hung up their badges and started pouring drinks instead of chasing criminals. Professional gamblers who'd made enough money at the poker tables decided to buy their own establishments. Even failed shopkeepers and down-on-their-luck farmers saw saloons as their ticket to financial freedom. The barrier to entry was laughably low compared to today's business world. Getting a license was easier than ordering a beer. Most frontier towns charged ridiculously small fees for saloon permits. We're talking about amounts that wouldn't buy you lunch today. Some places charged as little as $25 for a full year's license. Others asked for $50 and considered that steep. The paperwork, practically non-existent. Sign your name, pay the fee, and start serving whiskey. Nobody cared about your past when you wanted to open a bar. Former outlaws who'd supposedly gone straight could set up shop right next to the sheriff's office. Ex-convicts fresh out of territorial prisons found saloon ownership perfectly acceptable. The frontier didn't believe in holding grudges when there was money to be made. Your criminal history was less important than your ability to keep the drinks flowing and the cash coming in. But here's where it gets interesting. Many successful saloon owners came from surprisingly respectable backgrounds. Retired military officers who'd served their time on various frontier posts often opened bars when they mustered out. They understood discipline and how to handle rowdy crowds. These veteran-owned establishments tended to run smoother operations than the amateur-hour joints. Professional gamblers made natural saloon owners because they already understood the business of separating men from their money. They knew how to read people, spot trouble before it started, and keep games running smoothly. Plus, they had connections with other gamblers who could bring in steady customers. Some of the most famous saloons in the West were owned by former card sharks who traded their poker chips for bar rags. Then there were the opportunists who followed the money trails. When gold was discovered somewhere, these entrepreneurs packed up their belongings and raced to the new boom town. They'd throw together a makeshift bar faster than miners could stake their claims. These guys weren't necessarily drinking experts or hospitality professionals. They were just smart enough to know that thirsty men with gold dust in their pockets meant easy profits. Women occasionally owned saloons too, though it was far from common. Most female saloon owners were widows who inherited the business when their husbands died from gunfights, disease, or plain old bad luck. Some proved remarkably capable at running these rough establishments. They had to be twice as tough as their male counterparts to earn respect from customers who weren't used to taking orders from women. Local governments loved saloon owners for one simple reason: taxes. These businesses generated massive revenue for cash-strapped frontier towns. A successful saloon could pay more in annual fees and taxes than 10 regular businesses combined. Town councils practically rolled out red carpets for potential bar owners. They needed that steady income to fund basic services like law enforcement and road maintenance. The lack of regulation created some wild situations. Multiple saloons might open on the same street within weeks of each other. Competition was fierce and sometimes deadly. Owners would undercut each other's prices, steal each other's customers, and occasionally resort to more violent methods of eliminating business rivals. The free market was truly free, and sometimes brutal. Investment requirements varied wildly depending on location and ambition. A basic tent saloon in a new mining camp might cost a few $100s to establish. A fancy establishment in a growing town could require several $1,000s for proper furnishings, quality alcohol, and decent decorations. Most owners started small and expanded as profits allowed. Smart saloon owners diversified their income streams beyond just selling drinks. They rented out back rooms for gambling, charged fees for hosting traveling entertainers, and sometimes operated small general stores or barbershops in connected spaces. The most successful proprietors treated their saloons like community centers that happened to serve alcohol. What's fascinating is how quickly someone could go from customer to owner. A lucky gambler might win enough money in one night to buy out the establishment where he'd been playing cards. Stories exist of miners striking it rich and immediately purchasing the saloon where they'd been drowning their sorrows just days before. But ownership came with serious risks that extended far beyond financial loss. Saloon owners faced constant threats from drunk customers, disgruntled gamblers, and business rivals. They had to navigate complex relationships with local law enforcement while managing establishments that attracted society's most dangerous characters. The question remains, what kind of person willingly chose to spend their days surrounded by armed, intoxicated strangers in a business where violence was practically guaranteed? The answer reveals something fascinating about the type of individuals who shaped the American frontier. Back when saloons first opened their creaky wooden doors, nobody bothered checking the clock. These establishments ran around the clock, 7 days a week, miners stumbled in at dawn after night shifts. Cowboys rode into town at midnight looking for whiskey. Gamblers never cared what time it was anyway. The frontier didn't punch time cards, so neither did its watering holes. But here's where things get interesting. As towns grew from dusty camps into actual settlements, local governments started paying attention to those profitable little dens of vice. Town councils realized they were sitting on gold mines, not the kind you dug from the ground, but the kind that flowed from whiskey bottles into tax coffers. The transformation happened fast. One day saloons operated like wild animals with no leash. The next day, mayors and sheriffs showed up with papers, fees and rules. Suddenly saloon owners found themselves dealing with licensing requirements, operating permits and tax collectors who knew exactly how much money was changing hands over those rough wooden bars. Smart town leaders figured out the math quickly. A single busy saloon could generate more tax revenue than a dozen other businesses combined. Why? Because drinking never went out of style, and neither did gambling. Towns like Dodge City and Tombstone built their entire budgets around saloon taxes. The irony was delicious. These supposedly lawless establishments were funding law enforcement. License fees started small but grew fast. In some Colorado mining towns, saloon licenses jumped from $5 to $50 in just 2 years. That might not sound like much today, but back then $50 could buy you a decent horse. Saloon owners grumbled, but they paid up because the profits were too good to walk away from. Then there's the curious relationship between lawmen and the places they were supposed to regulate. Sheriffs, marshals and deputies spent enormous amounts of time inside saloons, not always drinking, though that happened too, but keeping the peace. Well, trying to anyway. Some lawmen took a hands-off approach. They'd wander in, check that nobody was actively bleeding on the floor, then move on. Others became regular fixtures, nursing beers while watching for trouble. The smart ones made friends with bartenders who served as unofficial intelligence networks. Bartenders heard everything. Who was planning what, which stranger had too much money, whose wife was stepping out. But the weirdest part about saloon law enforcement was how many former outlaws ended up running the establishments they once terrorized. Reformed rustlers became respectable saloon owners almost overnight. Town councils didn't ask too many questions about backgrounds, especially if the applicant had cash for licensing fees and looked capable of handling rowdy customers without calling for help. Local governments also discovered they could use regulations as weapons. Don't like a particular saloon owner? Raise his license fee. Want to shut down competition for your brother-in-law's bar? Create new health regulations that only target specific establishments. Selective enforcement became an art form in frontier towns. Sunday closing laws created the biggest headaches. Religious groups pressured town councils to force saloons closed on Sundays. Some saloon owners complied. Others found creative workarounds, like serving meals that happened to come with complimentary whiskey. The meals were usually stale crackers, but technically they were running restaurants, not saloons. Operating hours became another battleground. Towns tried limiting saloons to 12-hour days, but enforcement proved nearly impossible. How do you monitor 20 saloons with 2 part-time deputies? Saloon owners learned to post lookouts and develop signals for when law enforcement approached. The relationship between saloons and legal authority was like a complicated dance. Neither side wanted to push too hard. Towns needed the tax revenue, saloons needed to stay open, so they worked out unofficial agreements that kept money flowing while maintaining the appearance of law and order. Interestingly, many saloons operated more honestly than other frontier businesses. Crooked storekeepers could cheat customers on weights and measures. Dishonest horse traders could sell sick animals and disappear. But saloon owners faced their customers every single day. Cheat someone on drinks or gambling, and word spread fast in small communities. Legal troubles for saloons usually involved violence, not business practices. When fights broke out, property got damaged. Windows shattered, furniture splintered, and occasionally walls developed bullet holes. Town councils started requiring saloon owners to post bonds for damages. Break too much stuff, and your bond money disappeared into city repairs. The most successful saloon owners learned to work with law enforcement rather than against it. They'd tip off marshals about suspicious strangers, help track down wanted men, and even provide informal meeting spaces for town officials. This cooperation created an odd partnership between vice and virtue that somehow kept frontier communities functioning. As settlements matured, the legal noose around saloons tightened. But before we explore how different crowds mixed inside these establishments, it's worth noting that even the strictest regulations couldn't control who walked through those swinging doors. When the sun went down and work ended, Western saloons transformed into the busiest places in town. Cowboys fresh off the trail, miners with dust still coating their clothes, and fur trappers who hadn't seen civilization in months all crowded through those swinging doors. The mix was explosive, unpredictable, and sometimes downright dangerous. Cowboys made up the biggest chunk of saloon customers. After weeks or months driving cattle across empty plains, they hit town with money burning holes in their pockets and a powerful thirst. These weren't your Hollywood cowboys either. Most were young, barely out of their teens, earning maybe $30 a month for back-breaking work. They'd blow their entire pay in a single night, buying drinks for strangers and gambling away their future earnings before stumbling back to the bunkhouse. Then there were the miners. Gold seekers, silver hunters, and coal diggers all shared the same look of desperate hope mixed with bone-deep exhaustion. Some struck it rich and threw money around like confetti. Others nursed a single whiskey all evening, hoping their luck would change with the next hand of cards. The successful ones bought rounds for the house, while the broke ones begged for scraps and leftover drinks. Fur trappers brought their own brand of wildness to the scene. These mountain men spent months alone in the wilderness, talking to nobody but their horses and maybe a few trading post clerks. When they finally made it to town, they exploded with pent-up social energy. They told tall tales, picked fights over nothing, and drank like the world was ending tomorrow. Their buckskin clothes reeked of animal fat and wood smoke, clearing space around them at the bar whether they wanted it or not. But here's where things got really interesting. Gamblers treated saloons like their personal offices, setting up elaborate card games and separating fools from their money with practiced ease. These weren't amateurs playing for fun. Professional gamblers moved from town to town, following the money and the marks. They dressed better than most customers, spoke smoother, and always seemed to have cash when others went broke. Some were honest players with genuine skill. Others, well, let's just say their deck shuffling techniques would make a magician jealous. Outlaws mixed right in with everyone else, and nobody asked too many questions about where your money came from. Bank robbers, cattle rustlers, and wanted men found saloons to be perfect hiding spots. They could blend into the crowd, gather information about local law enforcement, and sometimes recruit new gang members from the desperate men around them. The smart ones kept quiet and avoided attention. The stupid ones bragged about their crimes and usually ended up dead or captured within days. Surprisingly, legitimate businessmen showed up too, though not as often as movies suggest. Traveling salesmen, land speculators, and cattle buyers used saloons as informal meeting places. They'd close deals over whiskey and shake hands on agreements worth thousands of dollars. Some of the biggest business transactions in the West happened at saloon tables, sealed with a drink and a spit in the palm. Even lawmen frequented these establishments, which created some awkward situations. Sheriffs and deputies needed to keep tabs on troublemakers, gather intelligence about criminal activity, and sometimes just unwind after dangerous days. They'd sit at the same bar as wanted men, playing an elaborate game of pretend where everyone knew the rules, but nobody spoke them out loud. Smart outlaws avoided towns where the local sheriff was known to be competent. Smart sheriffs sometimes pretended to be drunker than they actually were. The real tension came when different groups mixed. Cowboys looked down on miners as greedy dirt scratchers. Miners thought cowboys were empty-headed drifters. Both groups distrusted gamblers and outlaws, while mountain men considered themselves tougher than everyone else combined. Add alcohol to these prejudices, and fights became inevitable. Religious folks and temperance advocates painted all saloon customers with the same brush, calling them degenerates and sinners. The reality was more complicated. Many were just working men trying to forget their troubles for a few hours. Others were genuinely dangerous criminals who'd shoot you for looking at them wrong. Most fell somewhere in between, ordinary people living extraordinary lives in an unforgiving landscape. What made saloons truly dangerous wasn't just the individual customers, but how they interacted. Imagine stuffing dozens of armed, stressed, often drunk men into a small room with dim lighting and no real security. Add gambling disputes, personal grudges, and racial tensions that nobody talked about openly. Explosive doesn't begin to cover it. The characters who walked through saloon doors carried the entire story of the American West with them. Every face told a tale of ambition, desperation, violence, and hope. But it wasn't just the customers who made saloons legendary. The women who worked in these rough establishments faced their own unique challenges and played their own crucial roles in saloon life. Women in Wild West saloons occupied a fascinating and complicated position that most people completely misunderstand today. The popular image shows dance hall girls kicking up their heels while tough cowboys cheer them on. but the reality was far more complex and often darker than Hollywood suggests. Most saloons had strict men-only policies for regular patrons. Women couldn't just walk in and order a drink like their modern counterparts. The bar was considered a masculine domain, where rough language, tobacco spitting, and violent disputes were part of daily life. Respectable women avoided these establishments entirely, crossing the street rather than walking past the swinging doors. But here's where it gets interesting. While proper ladies stayed away, working women found saloons to be one of the few places on the frontier where they could earn decent money. These weren't just random women looking for easy work. Many were skilled entertainers, sharp businesswomen, or simply survivors making the best of limited options in a harsh environment. The most visible female presence came from dance hall performers and singers. These women provided entertainment that went far beyond simple musical acts. They danced with lonely miners who hadn't seen a woman in months, sang popular songs that reminded cowboys of home, and created an atmosphere that kept customers drinking longer and spending more money. Some possessed genuine talent and could have performed in any major city theater. Then there were the parlor girls or saloon girls who served drinks and provided companionship. Their job involved much more than carrying whiskey glasses. They had to be part bartender, part therapist, and part actress. A good parlor girl could convince a broke cowboy to spend his last dollar, calm down an angry drunk before a fight started, or charm information out of suspicious strangers. Smart saloon owners knew these women were worth their weight in gold. The line between entertainment and other services, often blurred in frontier saloons. Many establishments had rooms upstairs where additional business took place. Women working in these arrangements faced constant dangers from violent customers, disease, and social ostracism. Yet some managed to save enough money to eventually leave the saloon life behind, opening boarding houses, restaurants, or other legitimate businesses. What's remarkable is how much power some of these women wielded behind the scenes. Experienced saloon girls often advised owners about which customers to trust, which gamblers were cheating, and when trouble was brewing. They developed networks of information that rivaled anything lawmen could gather. A few even became saloon owners themselves, though this was extremely rare and required exceptional business skills plus considerable luck. The clothing these women wore became legendary in its own right. Bright colors, low necklines, and flashy jewelry served practical purposes beyond mere attraction. In dimly lit saloons filled with tobacco smoke, bold outfits helped women stand out and signal their availability for conversation or entertainment. The famous can-can dresses allowed freedom of movement for dancing while creating visual spectacle that drew crowds. Life for saloon women meant constant performance. They had to appear cheerful and engaging even when exhausted, sick, or dealing with personal problems. A woman showing genuine emotion, sadness, anger, or fear could lose customers and therefore income. This emotional labor was perhaps the most demanding aspect of their work, requiring skills that would impress any modern customer service trainer. The social isolation these women faced was brutal. Respectable townspeople shunned them completely. Churches refused them entry, merchants often charged higher prices or refused service altogether. Many saloon women formed tight bonds with each other, creating substitute families for support and protection. These relationships often lasted decades, long after their saloon days ended. Some saloon women achieved genuine fame and fortune. Calamity Jane, though more legend than typical example, represented the possibility of transcending traditional feminine roles on the frontier. Others, like poker-playing Alice Ivers, used saloons as stepping stones to independent careers. These success stories inspired countless other women to try their luck in the Wild West's most notorious establishments. The earnings could be substantial by frontier standards. A skilled entertainer might make more in one night than a cowboy earned in a month of dangerous work. However, the expenses were high too. Women had to pay for elaborate costumes, cosmetics, and medical care while saving money for an uncertain future when age or circumstances would force career changes. Violence was an ever-present threat. Drunk customers became unpredictable, jealous rivals could turn vicious, and law enforcement offered little protection. Many saloon women carried small pistols or knives for self-defense, and some became surprisingly skilled at using them when necessary. The temperance movement targeted these women with particular venom, portraying them as destroyers of family values and corrupted innocence. Yet many saloon women supported their elderly parents, sent money to siblings, or saved orphaned children, acts of generosity that the broader society rarely acknowledged. As frontier towns grew more civilized, attitudes towards saloon women began shifting in unexpected ways. But the entertainment and danger they brought to these establishments had already shaped something far more significant than anyone realized at the time. If you think modern bar drinks can be rough, wait until you hear what frontier settlers were pouring down their throats. The stuff they called whiskey in the Old West would probably strip paint off a barn door today. Most saloons served what they generously called whiskey, but calling it that was being pretty generous. Real aged whiskey from Kentucky or Tennessee cost too much to ship across the country by wagon train. Instead, saloon owners mixed their own concoctions using whatever they could get their hands on. Raw grain alcohol formed the base, then came the flavoring. Tobacco juice gave it color and a kick that would make your eyes water. Burnt sugar added sweetness and turned the liquid brown so it looked more like actual whiskey. The creativity didn't stop there though. Some bartenders threw in a little gunpowder for extra bite. Others added pepper, soap, or even strychnine in tiny doses. Strychnine, the same stuff used to kill rats. They claimed it gave the drink more character, but mostly it just made customers feel like they'd been kicked by a mule. Cowboys and miners had colorful names for these deadly mixtures. Tanglefoot was popular because it literally tangled up your feet when you tried to walk. Coffin varnish spoke for itself. Drink enough, and you might need that coffin sooner than expected. Tarantula juice burned going down and left you feeling like something venomous had bitten your throat. Rot gut, red eye, and busthead were other charming nicknames that pretty much told you everything you needed to know about the quality. Then there was something called 40-rod whiskey. The name came from the joke that it could kill a man at 40 rods distance. That's about 220 yards for those keeping track. Whether that was true or not, nobody wanted to test it. Beer existed in saloons, but don't expect anything like what we drink today. Most frontier towns didn't have ice, so beer got served warm or at room temperature. During summer months in places like Arizona or Nevada, room temperature meant pretty darn hot. The beer itself was often flat, sour, or both. Some saloon owners watered it down to stretch their supplies, which didn't exactly improve the taste. Getting fresh beer to remote mining camps or cattle towns was nearly impossible. Barrels had to travel hundreds of miles by wagon over rough roads. By the time they arrived, the contents had been shaken, heated, cooled, and shaken again. The result was something that technically qualified as beer, but tasted like it had been filtered through a saddle blanket. Local brewing attempts didn't always go better. Without proper equipment or knowledge, frontier brewers produced some truly awful batches. Stories tell of beer so bad that even thirsty cowboys spat it out. But people kept drinking it anyway because options were limited, and alcohol was alcohol. Hard liquor wasn't the only dangerous drink option, believe it or not. Some saloons offered medicinal beverages that were supposed to cure everything from headaches to broken hearts. These patent medicines often contained more alcohol than regular whiskey, plus unknown herbs and chemicals that could make you sicker than you started. Mexican pulque made from fermented cactus juice showed up in southwestern saloons. This thick, milky drink had an acquired taste that most Americans never acquired. It packed a powerful punch and left drinkers with legendary hangovers. Wine was rare and expensive, reserved for the fanciest establishments in big towns like San Francisco or Denver. Most frontier saloons couldn't afford to stock it, and customers couldn't afford to buy it. When wine did appear, it was often homemade from whatever fruit grew locally, and the results varied wildly. The worst part about saloon drinks wasn't just the taste or the hangover, the quality control was non-existent. Nobody tested these mixtures for safety. Saloon owners bought supplies from traveling peddlers who might be selling anything from decent alcohol to industrial solvent. Customers took their chances with every glass. Some saloons tried to mask the awful taste of their liquor by offering chasers, usually water or weak beer. Smart drinkers learned to eat something first, like the free hard-boiled eggs or crackers some bars provided. Food helped absorb some of the alcohol and lessened the shock to an empty stomach. Despite all these hazards, people kept drinking. Life on the frontier was hard, dangerous, and often boring. A shot of whiskey, even terrible whiskey, provided temporary escape from daily struggles. Cowboys finishing a long cattle drive didn't much care if their drink tasted like paint thinner. Miners coming up from underground just wanted something to wash the dust from their throats. The drinks were rough, but the people drinking them were rougher. They had to be to survive frontier life. But speaking of survival, the liquid courage flowing from these bottles often led to situations where survival skills really mattered, especially when it came to what people were eating alongside all this questionable alcohol. Hungry customers walking into a frontier saloon weren't exactly walking into a five-star restaurant. Most saloons treated food as an afterthought, something to keep people drinking longer rather than a main attraction. The menu was about as simple as you could get without serving nothing at all. Beans dominated most saloon kitchens, not fancy baked beans with molasses and spices, but plain old boiled beans that had been sitting in a pot for hours or sometimes days. They were cheap, filling, and hard to mess up completely. Saloon owners loved them because a big pot could feed dozens of customers for pennies. Customers tolerated them because they soaked up alcohol and kept you from passing out face first into your whiskey. Bread appeared on most tables, though calling it fresh baked would be generous. Hard biscuits were more common than soft loaves. Some places served cornbread that could double as a weapon if a bar fight broke out. The bread's main job was stretching your stomach so you could drink more without getting sick. Smart saloon owners figured out that hungry drinkers were broke drinkers. Then there were the pickled eggs. These things became legendary in saloon culture, floating in big glass jars like scientific specimens. They lasted forever without refrigeration, which made them perfect for places that might not see a food delivery for weeks. Plus, all that salt made customers even thirstier. The eggs tasted about as appetizing as they looked, but desperate men ate desperate food. Salted meat showed up frequently, usually jerky or preserved pork that had traveled hundreds of miles in wagon trains. Fresh meat was rare unless someone had recently shot a deer or a saloon owner kept chickens out back. The salt helped preserve the meat, but it also made everything taste like you were licking a rock. More thirst, more drinks, more profit. Oysters might sound fancy, but frontier oysters were nothing like the delicate shellfish served in fancy Eastern restaurants. These came packed in barrels of salt water and had traveled for weeks to reach remote saloons. By the time they made it to your plate, they were more adventure than appetizer. Eating saloon oysters required either serious courage or serious alcohol consumption, usually both. Let's not forget the cheese. When saloons could get it, cheese appeared as hard chunks that customers carved off with their own knives. Mice loved saloon cheese almost as much as customers did. Smart bartenders kept the cheese wheels wrapped up tight, but mice were persistent little creatures with plenty of time to work. Fancier establishments sometimes offered steaks, but these weren't the tender cuts you might expect. Frontier beef was tough from cattle that had walked hundreds of miles to market. Saloon cooks usually fried steaks until they resembled leather, then served them with whatever beans or potatoes were available. The steaks cost extra, which meant most customers stuck to the cheaper options. Potatoes appeared in various forms when saloons could get them, boiled, fried, or baked. They filled stomachs without breaking budgets. Irish immigrants often ran saloon kitchens, and they knew how to make potatoes edible, even when everything else went wrong. A good potato could make even the worst whiskey seem tolerable. Soup was popular during cold months, though soup might be too generous a term. Most saloon soups were whatever ingredients were available, thrown into a pot with water and boiled until something resembling food emerged. Customers learned not to ask too many questions about what exactly was floating in their bowl. But here's the weird part. The food's poor quality was actually intentional in many cases. Saloon owners discovered that salty, spicy, or just plain bad food made customers drink more. A plate of over-salted beans guaranteed at least 3 more beers. Terrible jerky that burned your throat meant another whiskey to wash it down. Some saloons offered free lunch to attract customers, but nothing was really free. The lunch might not cost money directly, but you were expected to buy drinks, lots of drinks. The free lunch usually consisted of the saltiest, most thirst-inducing foods the saloon could serve. Customers thought they were getting a deal, but they ended up spending more on drinks than they would have on a regular meal. Kitchen hygiene was about what you'd expect in places where men spit on floors and wiped their hands on their pants. Dishes got washed when someone remembered to wash them. Food storage meant keeping things away from the biggest rats. Health inspectors didn't exist, so saloon cooks operated by their own standards. The rougher the saloon, the rougher the food. High-end establishments in bigger towns might actually employ real cooks who knew their way around a kitchen. But your typical frontier saloon treated the kitchen as a place to heat things up and serve them fast. While the food kept customers from starving, it was really just fuel for the main attraction. Speaking of attractions, saloons needed more than bad food and good whiskey to keep customers entertained for hours. The drinks were flowing, the music was playing, and men were pulling out their wallets for something that had nothing to do with alcohol. Gambling ruled the Western saloon just as much as whiskey did. In fact, many saloon owners made more money from card games than they ever did from selling drinks. Poker dominated every table. 5-card stud was the game of choice, though draw poker had its fans too. Cowboys would sit for hours, nursing a single whiskey while betting their monthly wages on a pair of jacks. The rules were simple enough for anyone to learn, but mastering the art of reading faces and calculating odds, that took years. Then there was Faro, the king of all saloon games. This French card game spread across America like wildfire, and every decent saloon had at least one Faro table. Players bet on which cards would appear from a dealing box, and the house always had a slight edge. Smart gamblers knew this, but they played anyway. The thrill was worth the risk. Saloon owners weren't stupid about the money involved. They charged table fees, took cuts from big pots, and sometimes dealt the cards themselves. A busy gambling night could bring in more cash than a week of selling drinks. Some establishments were really gambling halls that happened to serve alcohol, not the other way around. The equipment told its own story. Professional Faro tables came with intricate layouts painted on green felt. Poker tables were simpler but sturdy enough to handle heated arguments and the occasional fist fight. Chips weren't always available, so players used coins, gold dust, or anything else of value. A silver watch might sit next to a bag of gold nuggets in the same pot. Cheating was practically an art form. Professional gamblers carried marked cards, dealt from the bottom of the deck, and used mirrors to see opponents' hands. Saloon owners sometimes looked the other way if the cheater was spending money on drinks. But get caught cheating the wrong person. That could end with a bullet instead of just being thrown out the door. The weird part is how gambling created its own social rules. A man could lose his horse, his gun, and his last dollar in a card game, but as long as he took it with dignity, he'd still be welcome back. Sore losers, however, found themselves banned faster than you could shuffle a deck. Professional gamblers were celebrities in their own right. These men dressed better than most saloon patrons, with fancy vests and clean shirts. They traveled from town to town following the money and the action. Some were honest players who won through skill. Others were con artists who'd skip town before anyone figured out their tricks. Let's not forget the house dealers. Saloon owners hired these men to run games and keep things moving. A good dealer could spot trouble before it started and knew when to cut someone off from playing. They also knew exactly how to keep games going all night long, which meant more money for everyone involved. Women rarely played cards in saloons, but they sometimes worked as dealers or helped run games. A pretty woman dealing Faro could draw twice as many players as a male dealer. These women were skilled at keeping men focused on their cards and their wallets instead of causing trouble. The stakes varied wildly depending on the town and the players. A cowboy might bet his week's wages on a single hand, while a successful mine owner could lose thousands in one night. Some games started small and grew as more players joined. Others began with high stakes that scared away all but the most confident gamblers. Gambling debts were serious business. A man's word was his bond, and refusing to pay could result in anything from a beating to a bullet. Some saloons kept informal credit systems, allowing regular customers to play on promises to pay later. This worked fine until someone skipped town or couldn't cover their losses. The most successful saloon owners understood that gambling and drinking went hand in hand. Free drinks for big players kept them at the tables longer. Hungry gamblers would order food without leaving their seats. The longer someone stayed, the more money they'd likely lose. But the real money came from understanding human nature. Saloon owners knew that men who'd just lost big would often double down, trying to win everything back in one desperate play. They also knew that winners would keep playing, convinced their luck would continue forever. Some saloons even rigged their games, using marked cards or crooked dealers to guarantee the house would win. Players suspected this happened but often couldn't prove it. Complaining too loudly about unfair games was a good way to find yourself unwelcome in every saloon in town. Of course, all this gambling created its own problems. Arguments over cheating, disputes about rules, and fights over money turned deadly more often than anyone wanted to admit. But that's exactly what made saloon life so dangerous for everyone involved. Violence in Wild West saloons wasn't just common, it was practically guaranteed. Walk into any frontier bar on any given night, and you'd witness everything from broken bottles flying through the air to full-blown gunfights that left men bleeding on sawdust floors. The combination of cheap whiskey, gambling disputes, and armed strangers created a powder keg that exploded regularly. Most fights started over the stupidest things you can imagine. Someone accused another player of cheating at cards, a cowboy bumped into a miner at the bar, two men argued over who got served first. Hell, some brawls erupted because somebody didn't like the way another fellow looked at them. With everyone carrying guns and most people half drunk, minor disagreements escalated faster than wildfire. The weapons of choice varied depending on how civilized folks were feeling that particular evening. Fists came first, naturally. Then came chairs, bottles, and anything else within grabbing distance. Pool cues made excellent clubs. Bar stools worked perfectly for skull cracking. But when tempers really flared, out came the revolvers. The smart money always bet on whoever drew fastest, not whoever started the argument. Saloon owners learned to expect damage as part of doing business. Broken mirrors cost serious money, but they got smashed so often that many proprietors switched to cheap tin reflectors instead. Tables took such regular beatings that most bars kept extra lumber stacked out back for quick repairs. Some establishments went through several sets of glassware per week during particularly rowdy periods. Then there were the professional troublemakers who seemed to live for saloon fights. These weren't your average drunk cowboys stumbling around. These were guys who picked fights for sport. They'd walk into a bar specifically looking for someone to provoke. Local toughs built reputations based on how many men they'd beaten, unconscious or shot dead in various drinking establishments across town. Bouncers became essential employees in any saloon worth its salt. The best ones were massive men who could physically throw grown adults out the front door without breaking a sweat. Others relied more on intimidation, carrying sawed-off shotguns or brass knuckles to convince troublemakers to take their business elsewhere. Smart saloon owners paid their muscle well because finding good bouncers wasn't easy. The job had a remarkably high mortality rate. Some towns recorded multiple saloon shootings every single day. Dodge City's newspapers regularly featured headlines about the previous night's bar casualties. Tombstone went through periods where undertakers couldn't keep up with the steady stream of bodies coming out of local watering holes. The phrase "another quiet night at the saloon" became a running joke among frontier journalists. Law enforcement had mixed relationships with saloon violence. Many sheriffs and deputies spent their off-duty hours drinking in the same establishments they'd later investigate for murders and assaults. Some lawmen owned pieces of saloons themselves, creating obvious conflicts of interest when trouble broke out. Others simply gave up trying to police every bar fight, only responding when someone actually died. The strangest part, most saloon patrons accepted the violence as normal entertainment. Men would continue playing cards while someone got beaten senseless 3 tables away. Bartenders kept serving drinks during knife fights. Regular customers developed an almost supernatural ability to duck flying objects without spilling their whiskey. Cheating at gambling guaranteed the worst kind of saloon violence. Getting caught with marked cards or loaded dice meant facing an angry crowd of men who'd lost their hard-earned money. These weren't quick fistfights. They were brutal beatings that sometimes ended with the cheater getting dragged into the street and shot. Professional gamblers knew the risks but kept playing because the money was too good to resist. Women working in saloons faced their own unique dangers. Jealous customers fought over dancers and serving girls regularly. Some establishments hired armed guards specifically to protect their female employees from overly aggressive patrons. But even with protection, working in a frontier saloon meant accepting that violence could erupt around you without warning. Interestingly, some saloons developed reputations for being relatively peaceful. These establishments usually catered to a higher class of clientele, businessmen, traveling salesmen, and local dignitaries who preferred civilized drinking to barroom brawling. But even the fanciest saloons weren't immune to occasional outbursts of frontier justice. The real tragedy was how preventable most saloon violence actually was. Better lighting might have reduced cheating accusations. Watered-down drinks could have kept tempers cooler. Stricter weapons policies might have saved lives. But frontier saloons operated in a world where personal honor mattered more than personal safety, and backing down from a fight marked a man as a coward. Of course, all this violence attracted some very interesting characters to saloon life. Famous lawmen and notorious outlaws both made names for themselves in frontier drinking establishments, creating legends that would outlast the saloons themselves. When it came to the Wild West's most legendary figures, saloons weren't just backdrops in their stories. They were the stages where history's most famous outlaws and lawmen played out some of their most dramatic moments. But here's what gets really interesting about these relationships. The line between good guys and bad guys got pretty blurry when everyone was bellied up to the same bar. Take Wyatt Earp, probably the most famous lawman of the Old West. Most folks know him from the OK Corral shootout, but what they don't realize is that Earp spent way more time running saloons than he ever did chasing outlaws. He owned the Dexter Saloon in Nomi, Alaska, and had stakes in several others throughout his career. The man made more money serving drinks than serving justice. Makes you wonder who the real business genius was, right? Then there's Doc Holliday, Earp's gambling buddy and dentist turned gunfighter. This guy practically lived in saloons not because he was a drunk, but because that's where the best poker games happened. Holliday could pull teeth in the morning and clean out a gambling table by evening. He was a regular at the Oriental Saloon in Tombstone, where he'd sit with his back to the wall and his gun within easy reach. Smart man, he knew that in saloons your biggest threat usually came from behind, not in front. But the really wild part about saloon culture was how it mixed outlaws and lawmen like ingredients in a dangerous cocktail. Jesse James and his gang used saloons as hideouts, meeting spots and intelligence gathering centers. They'd sit in back rooms playing cards and planning their next bank robbery while local sheriffs drank whiskey just a few tables away. Sometimes these same sheriffs were taking bribes to look the other way. Other times they genuinely had no idea who was sitting right under their noses. Wild Bill Hickok learned the hard way that saloons could be death traps for famous lawmen. He was playing poker in Nuttall and Mann's saloon in Deadwood when Jack McCall walked up behind him and put a bullet in his head. Hickok was holding aces and eights, now called the dead man's hand, and broke his own rule about never sitting with his back to the room. That single moment turned a routine card game into Old West legend. Let's not forget that some of the most notorious outlaws actually started as saloon employees before they turned to crime. The Dalton gang's Grat Dalton worked as a bartender before he decided robbing trains paid better. He knew every trick in the book about watered-down whiskey and marked cards because he'd been on the business side of the bar. When you think about it, bartending was excellent training for a life of crime. You learned to read people, handle money and spot trouble before it started. What made saloons perfect for both outlaws and lawmen was their unique social structure. These weren't just drinking establishments, they were neutral territories where information flowed as freely as the whiskey. A smart lawman could learn more about local crime in one night at the bar than in a week of formal investigation. Meanwhile, outlaws used the same environment to case their next targets, recruit accomplices, and disappear into crowds of equally suspicious-looking characters. Some saloons became legendary specifically because of their criminal clientele. The Long Branch Saloon in Dodge City saw more famous outlaws pass through its doors than most prisons. Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen, was known to hold court there between cattle-rustling operations. She'd drink with cowboys, flirt with lawmen, and plan crimes all in the same evening. The woman had style, you had to give her that. And the weird part is how many lawmen ended up owning saloons after their law enforcement careers ended. Bat Masterson went from sheriff to saloon owner to sports writer. Now that's a career change nobody saw coming. These guys understood that saloons were where the real power lay in frontier towns. Control the flow of alcohol and information, and you controlled the community. The most famous example of this saloon-centered drama was probably the tensions that led up to the gunfight at the OK Corral. The whole conflict started brewing in Tombstone's saloons where the Earp brothers and the Cowboys faction would drink, gamble and exchange increasingly hostile words. The actual shootout might have lasted 30 seconds, but the real drama played out over months in places like the Oriental Saloon and the Alhambra. But here's where things get really complicated. Sometimes the same person would be an outlaw in one town and a lawman in the next. The frontier was that chaotic. Which brings us to an even stranger aspect of saloon culture, the complex world of vice that surrounded these establishments, where the lines between entertainment and crime became even more blurred. The saloon wasn't just about whiskey and poker. Behind those swinging doors lay a darker world that most people today prefer to forget. Many Western saloons operated as full-service vice dens combining drinking, gambling and prostitution under one roof. The upstairs rooms that travelers thought were for lodging, well, they served a very different purpose. Brothels attached to saloons were as common as spittoons on the floor. Saloon owners discovered early that sex sold just as well as alcohol, maybe better. A typical setup involved the main bar on the ground floor, with a narrow staircase leading to small rooms above. The women who worked these establishments weren't just serving drinks. They were part of an integrated business model that maximized profits from every square foot of space. The connection between drinking and prostitution made perfect business sense. Men with money in their pockets and alcohol in their systems became generous customers. Saloon girls, as they were politely called, would encourage patrons to buy more drinks while negotiating other services. Some establishments charged by the hour for upstairs visits, while others worked on commission systems that kept the women tied to the saloon indefinitely. But the vice didn't stop there. Opium dens frequently shared space with drinking establishments, especially in larger frontier towns. Chinese immigrants had brought opium smoking to the American West, and enterprising saloon owners quickly saw another revenue stream. Back rooms filled with low beds and dim lighting catered to customers seeking different kinds of escape. The sweet, cloying smell of opium smoke mixed with tobacco and whiskey created an atmosphere that respectable citizens found both fascinating and horrifying. These multi-purpose vice establishments created their own social hierarchies. The most successful saloon girls could afford better clothes, and sometimes accumulated enough money to leave the business entirely. Others became trapped in cycles of debt to the saloon owners, owing money for room, board, clothing, and other necessities. The system kept women dependent while maximizing owner profits. Let's not forget the gambling component that tied everything together. Professional gamblers often worked in partnership with brothel operators, sharing information about wealthy marks and coordinating efforts to separate customers from their money. A man might lose his wages at the poker table, then spend his remaining cash upstairs, creating an efficient system for extracting every available dollar. The layout of these establishments reflected their multiple purposes. Ground floors featured the standard saloon setup with long bars and gambling tables. Upper floors were divided into small rooms, each barely large enough for a bed and washstand. Some places included hidden passages and back staircases for discreet exits, acknowledging that many customers preferred to keep their visits private. Law enforcement's relationship with these businesses was complicated, to put it mildly. Many sheriffs and marshals were regular customers themselves. Others accepted regular payments to look the other way when complaints arose. In some towns, the tax revenue from licensed brothels helped fund local government operations, creating financial incentives to maintain the status quo. The women working in saloon brothels came from diverse backgrounds. Some were widows with few other economic options. Others had fled abusive situations or family scandals back east. A surprising number were immigrants who spoke little English and had been deceived about the nature of their employment. The promise of steady work and housing in frontier towns attracted women who discovered too late what their jobs actually entailed. Medical care in these establishments was practically non-existent. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly through both workers and customers, but frontier towns rarely had doctors equipped to handle such problems. Many saloon brothels kept their own supplies of mercury-based treatments that often caused more harm than the original infections. Then there were the territorial differences in how these businesses operated. California gold rush towns developed elaborate pleasure districts with fancy brothels that catered to successful miners. Texas cattle towns preferred simpler operations that could pack up and move when the herds shifted to different routes. Mountain mining camps sometimes saw women command premium prices due to sheer scarcity. The reputation of saloons as dens of sin wasn't entirely unfair. These businesses actively promoted vice and profited from human weakness in ways that shocked even frontier sensibilities. Stories of violence, exploitation, and moral corruption surrounding saloon brothels provided plenty of ammunition for temperance advocates and religious reformers who wanted to shut down the entire industry. And the weird part is how normalized it all became. Frontier newspapers ran discreet advertisements for boarding houses for gentlemen and social clubs that everyone understood were brothels. Respectable businessmen invested in these establishments while publicly supporting moral reform movements. The combination of alcohol, gambling, prostitution, and sometimes drugs created explosive situations that went far beyond simple bar fights. Jealous customers fought over women, cheated gamblers sought revenge, and territorial disputes between competing establishments sometimes erupted into organized violence. But the tide was turning. As frontier towns grew into established communities with schools and churches, pressure mounted to clean up the saloons and separate drinking from other vices. The frontier saloon wasn't just a place to get drunk and cause trouble. These rough wooden buildings became the beating heart of countless western towns, serving purposes that would surprise most people today. While Hollywood loves showing shootouts and card games, the real story reveals something far more interesting. Most frontier settlements were lucky to have a handful of buildings when they started. There might be a general store, maybe a blacksmith shop, and almost certainly a saloon. But here's the thing that catches people off guard. That saloon often doubled as the town's unofficial city hall, community center, and information hub all rolled into one. Elections happened in saloons more often than you'd think. Makes sense when you consider these were often the only buildings large enough to hold a crowd. Voters would gather around the same tables where poker games usually took place, casting their ballots for sheriff, mayor, or territorial representatives. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that democracy was happening in the same spot where fights broke out over card games just hours earlier. Then there's the mail situation. Forget about official post offices. Those were luxuries most boom towns couldn't afford yet. Saloon owners frequently took on the job of handling mail delivery. Letters would pile up behind the bar, and folks would stop by to check if anything had arrived for them. Some bartenders became surprisingly good at memorizing who was expecting what. They'd sort through mail pouches from stagecoaches, making sure important messages reached the right people. The weird part is how saloons turned into makeshift medical offices. Traveling doctors and dentists had nowhere else to set up shop, so they'd rent space in the back rooms of saloons. Picture this, someone getting a tooth pulled while piano music and gambling noise filtered through the thin walls. These medical visits weren't exactly sterile affairs, but desperate times called for creative solutions. Job hunting also happened at the local watering hole. Ranch owners looking for cowhands would post notices on saloon walls. Mining companies advertised for workers the same way. Lost cattle announcements, reward posters for stolen horses, and notices about missing persons all found their way onto those rough wooden walls. The saloon became the town's bulletin board by default. Let's not forget about the entertainment factor that went beyond drinking. Saloons hosted dances when the community wanted to celebrate something. A successful cattle drive, news of statehood, or just the arrival of spring might trigger an impromptu dance party. Tables got pushed aside, someone brought out a fiddle, and the whole town would crowd in. These weren't fancy affairs, just people making the most of limited social options. Prize fights drew massive crowds to saloons. Boxing matches were huge entertainment in the Old West, and saloons provided the perfect venue. Bets would fly as fast as punches, and the excitement could last for hours. Some saloon owners organized regular fighting events, turning violence into profit. The line between entertainment and actual bar fights sometimes got pretty blurry. Business meetings happened around saloon tables too. Cattle ranchers would negotiate deals over whiskey. Mining claims got bought and sold during card games. Land disputes were sometimes settled through conversations that started at the bar and ended with handshake agreements. The informal atmosphere actually helped some deals happen that might have stalled in more formal settings. Religious services occasionally took place in saloons when no church existed yet. Traveling preachers weren't too proud to hold sermons wherever people would gather. The same room that hosted gambling and drinking on Saturday night might echo with hymns on Sunday morning. Some folks found this arrangement scandalous, but frontier life demanded flexibility. Weather played a role in making saloons central to community life. During harsh winters or brutal summer heat, the saloon might be the only comfortable public space available. People gathered there not just to drink, but to escape extreme temperatures and socialize with neighbors. Long winter months made these gathering places essential for mental health. The strangest community service saloons provided was hosting town meetings to discuss local problems. Disputes over water rights, arguments about where to build roads, and debates over law enforcement all happened in rooms that reeked of whiskey and tobacco. Democracy was messy business on the frontier, and saloons were perfectly suited for messy discussions. Some saloon owners took their civic duties seriously, organizing community events and maintaining order during important gatherings. Others just wanted the extra income from renting space. Either way, these establishments became indispensable parts of frontier life. But not every saloon achieved legendary status through community service alone. Some became famous for entirely different reasons: their incredible size, outrageous luxury, or unique features that attracted visitors from hundreds of miles away. Not all saloons were built the same. While most frontier bars were simple wooden shacks with dirt floors, some became legendary landmarks that travelers would ride hundreds of miles just to see. These weren't your average bug-infested gin mills. The Dexter Saloon in Nome, Alaska, stood 2 stories tall and stretched an entire city block. Built during the gold rush of 1900, it could pack in over 500 miners at once. The building had electric lights when most of Alaska still used candles. Downstairs, you'd find the longest bar in the territory, a massive mahogany counter that took 6 bartenders to work properly. Upstairs, that's where the real action happened, with private gambling rooms where fortunes changed hands nightly. Well, the Dexter wasn't alone in its grandeur. The Crystal Palace Saloon in Tombstone, Arizona, featured actual crystal chandeliers imported from San Francisco. The owner, Charles Brown, wanted to create something that rivaled the fancy establishments back east. He succeeded. The place had velvet curtains, polished brass fixtures, and a mirror behind the bar that cost more than most cowboys made in a year. Doc Holliday himself was known to deal cards there, right beneath those sparkling chandeliers. Then there's the opposite end of the spectrum, tiny saloons that became famous for their uniqueness rather than their size. The smallest operating saloon in the West was probably Murphy's Place in Goldfield, Nevada. The entire building measured just 12 feet by 8 feet. Murphy could serve maybe 6 customers at once, but he made up for the cramped quarters with the strongest whiskey in 3 counties. Miners called it liquid dynamite, and Murphy was proud of that reputation. Some saloons gained fame for their bizarre architectural features. The Bucket of Blood in Virginia City, Nevada, got its name from more than just the fights that happened inside. The building was constructed on such a steep slope that the back door opened onto the second floor of the building next door. Customers could literally walk in on ground level and exit through a window 20 feet up. Makes sense for quick getaways, right? The most unusual saloon design belonged to Jake's Place in Deadwood, South Dakota. Jake Johnson, a former ship captain, built his bar to look exactly like the interior of a sailing vessel, complete with rope railings, ship wheels for decoration, and curved walls that made you feel like you were at sea. The weird part is that Jake had never actually been a sailor. He just thought it would attract customers. It worked. Let's not forget the saloons that became famous for their sheer extravagance. The Varieties Theater and Saloon in New Orleans wasn't technically in the frontier West, but it influenced many Western establishments. This place had 3 floors, 15 different bars and over 40 gambling tables. The main bar alone was 60 feet long and carved from a single piece of mahogany. Western saloon owners heard stories about the Varieties and tried to copy its success in their own rough towns. But why did some saloon owners go to such extremes? Simple: competition was fierce. In a town with 30 saloons serving a few hundred people, you needed something special to stand out. The Long Branch Saloon in Dodge City became legendary partly because of its elaborate front facade with ornate wooden trim and painted signs. Inside it was fairly standard, but that fancy exterior drew customers like moths to a flame. The strangest architectural choice had to be the underground saloon in Goldfield, Nevada. Built entirely below ground level to stay cool during the desert summers, customers had to walk down a flight of stone steps to reach the bar. The owner, Pete Morrison, claimed it was the only saloon in America where you could drink whiskey while standing below your horse's hooves. He wasn't wrong. Some saloons gained fame for their massive size. The Alhambra Saloon in Tombstone was so large it had separate sections for different activities. One area for drinking, another for gambling, a third for dining, and even a small theater for entertainment. Most saloons crammed everything into one room, but the Alhambra gave customers space to spread out, and the weird part is that many of these special saloons didn't last long. The fancier they were, the more expensive they were to maintain. When gold rushes ended, or cattle drives stopped coming through town, elaborate saloons often went bankrupt first. Their owners had invested too much in crystal chandeliers and mahogany bars to survive economic downturns. The legacy of these special saloons lives on today. Many have been restored as museums or tourist attractions. The Crystal Palace in Tombstone still operates, serving drinks to visitors who want to experience a piece of the Old West. These weren't just places to drink, they were architectural statements, business experiments, and sometimes pure folly. But not every saloon story involved fancy fixtures or unusual buildings. The drinks themselves had their own colorful history, complete with names that would make a modern bartender scratch their head in confusion. Western saloon drinks didn't just have colorful names, they had names that could scare a grizzly bear. When a cowboy ordered coffin varnish or tarantula juice, he wasn't just buying a drink, he was gambling with his life. One shot glass at a time. Red Eye was probably the most popular drink name across the frontier. The whiskey earned this nickname because it literally made your eyes bloodshot, not from crying, from the raw alcohol burning through your system like liquid fire. Bartenders served Red Eye straight from the barrel. No ice, no chaser, just pure frontier courage in a glass. Then there was Towers Lightning, a whiskey so strong it supposedly came with its own thunder. This particular blend originated in Towers, New Mexico, where local distillers mixed grain alcohol with whatever they could find. The result, a drink that hit harder than a mule kick and left grown men seeing stars. Cowboys claimed one shot of Towers Lightning could knock you sideways, but 2 shots might actually straighten you back up again. Coffin varnish got its grim name from the belief that drinking enough of it would prepare your insides for the grave. The whiskey was so harsh that bartenders joked it could preserve a man from the inside out. Some saloons even advertised their coffin varnish with skull and crossbones signs, turning potential death into a marketing gimmick. Dark humor was apparently as popular as the drinks themselves. Tanglefoot promised to tangle up your feet before you even left the bar. This particular concoction mixed cheap whiskey with tobacco juice, gunpowder, and sometimes a dash of turpentine. The name perfectly described what happened to anyone brave enough to drink more than a glass. Their feet would get so tangled up they'd need help finding the door. Bartenders kept a running tally of how many customers couldn't walk straight after sampling their Tanglefoot. But the creativity didn't stop with whiskey. 40 Rod earned its name because it could supposedly kill a man at 40 rods distance. That's about 220 yards. Whether this was from the smell or the actual drinking remained hotly debated in saloon circles. Some claimed you could smell 40 Rod from across the street, which made it perfect for cowboys who wanted to clear out unwanted company. Busthead was exactly what it sounded like. This moonshine variant packed such a punch that customers regularly woke up with splitting headaches and no memory of how they got there. Saloon owners loved serving Busthead because it was cheap to make and guaranteed to knock out troublemakers before they could start fights. 2 shots of Busthead could turn the meanest outlaw into a sleeping baby. Snakebite medicine claimed to cure rattlesnake bites, though nobody was foolish enough to test this theory. The drink mixed raw alcohol with herbs, snake oil, and whatever mysterious ingredients the bartender had lying around. Cowboys bought it more for the name than any medicinal properties. After all, if something called snakebite medicine couldn't cure you, at least it might make dying more pleasant. Some drinks got named after their effects rather than their ingredients. Leg stretcher was supposed to give you the energy to dance all night, though most customers found their legs stretched out under the table instead. Eye opener promised to wake you up better than coffee, and it delivered, mainly because the alcohol content could wake the dead. Prairie Dew sounded innocent enough, like morning moisture on the grass. Wrong. This was another name for pure grain alcohol mixed with water, and whatever flavoring the bartender felt like adding that day. The dew part came from how it made you sweat like you'd been working under the prairie sun for hours. The weird part is, many of these recipe secrets died with their creators. Bartenders guarded their mixing formulas like state secrets, passing them down only to trusted successors or taking them to the grave. Modern historians can guess at ingredients, but the exact proportions remain mysteries. Some drinks were probably better left forgotten anyway. Skullcracker lived up to its violent promise, while Widowmaker carried an even darker reputation. These weren't just drinks, they were warnings disguised as entertainment. Cowboys knew exactly what they were getting into when they ordered something with skull or widow in the name. Let's not forget that naming drinks became a point of pride for saloon owners. A memorable name could make a mediocre whiskey famous, while a boring name doomed even good alcohol to obscurity. Competition between bars often came down to who had the most creative and terrifying drink names. The legacy of these colorful names shows how frontier humor mixed danger with entertainment. Cowboys facing daily risks from cattle stampedes, gunfights, and harsh weather found twisted comedy in drinks that might actually kill them. But this naming creativity was just one part of saloon culture that mixed business with questionable medical advice. The line between medicine and whiskey in the Old West was thinner than a playing card. Most frontier towns had maybe one real doctor for hundreds of miles. What they did have was plenty of saloon owners ready to cure whatever ailed you with a shot of their finest rock gut. Whiskey wasn't just entertainment back then. It was medical treatment, surgical anesthetic, and liquid courage all rolled into one amber-colored package. Got a toothache? Whiskey. Bullet wound? More whiskey. Can't sleep? Well, you get the idea. The alcohol content in some of these frontier spirits ran so high that bartenders could literally sterilize wounds with the stuff. Makes sense, right? But here's where things got interesting. Some saloon keepers actually believed they were practicing medicine. They'd mix their own special concoctions, adding herbs, roots, and God knows what else to create medicinal drinks. These weren't just random experiments either. Many of these amateur pharmacists had recipe books filled with supposed cures for everything from snake bites to broken hearts. The most popular medical whiskey went by names that would make your hair curl. Dr. Thompson's eye water wasn't for your eyes at all. It was straight grain alcohol mixed with enough mystery ingredients to knock a horse unconscious. Holsteter's stomach bitters promised to cure digestive problems but probably created more than it solved. These bottles lined saloon shelves right next to the regular drinking whiskey, and customers often couldn't tell the difference. Then there were the traveling doctors who set up shop right inside saloons. These characters would roll into town with a wagon full of bottles, claiming their special elixirs could cure anything from baldness to tuberculosis. They'd rent space from the saloon owner, give dramatic speeches about their miraculous cures, then sell bottles of what was essentially flavored alcohol to desperate frontier folks. The saloon got a cut of the profits, and everyone went home happy. Well, everyone except the patients. The weird part is that some of these treatments actually worked. Not because of any magical properties, but because high-proof alcohol really could disinfect wounds and numb pain. Cowboys who got shot or stabbed often survived because someone poured whiskey on their injuries. The alcohol killed bacteria that would have caused deadly infections. Of course, it also caused plenty of other problems, but that's another story. Local saloon owners started advertising their establishments as medical centers. Signs outside bars would promise medicinal spirits and healing tonics available daily. Some saloons even had separate sections where the medical drinking happened, though the drinks came from the same barrels as everything else. It was brilliant marketing disguised as healthcare. Women who were normally banned from most saloons could enter these establishments if they claimed to need medical treatment. This created some awkward situations. Respectable ladies would sneak into saloons claiming they needed medicinal whiskey for their nerves. Everyone knew what was really happening, but nobody wanted to call out a sick woman. The saloon owners loved it because it doubled their customer base. The recipes for these medical concoctions were closely guarded secrets. Bartenders would mix their special brews in back rooms, adding ingredients like rattlesnake oil, cactus juice and crushed beetles. They'd bottle the results with handwritten labels promising miracle cures. Some of these bottles sold for 10 times the price of regular whiskey, and desperate people paid gladly. But let's not forget the dangers lurking in every glass. Many of these homemade medicines contained ingredients that were downright poisonous. Lead, mercury, and other toxic metals found their way into the mix. Customers who came in with minor ailments sometimes left with much worse problems. The cure really was worse than the disease in many cases. Military doctors stationed at frontier forts often relied on saloon whiskey for their medical practices. They'd buy entire barrels from local establishments to use as antiseptic during surgeries. Army records show that some procedures had better success rates when performed in saloons rather than military hospitals, probably because the alcohol content in the air killed germs floating around. The most successful saloon doctors created their own brands of medicinal whiskey. These entrepreneurs would trademark names like Prairie Lightning Health Tonic and Cowboys Cure All. They'd distribute their products to other saloons across the territory, building mini empires based on bottled alcohol disguised as medicine. Some illnesses did improve after visits to these makeshift medical saloons, though not for the reasons anyone expected. Customers suffering from anxiety, depression, or chronic pain found temporary relief in the bottom of a whiskey glass. A talented piano player could literally change the atmosphere of an entire room with the right song at the right moment. The weird part is how many saloon workers became local celebrities in their own right. Customers would travel miles to visit their favorite bartender or hear their preferred piano player. Some barmaids had devoted followings who showed up just to chat with them. In towns where entertainment was scarce, saloon staff provided much-needed personality and human connection. Owners also had to deal with inventory challenges that would make modern business owners weep. Whiskey shipments arrived spoiled, beer barrels leaked, and glasses broke constantly in fights. Restocking meant waiting weeks or months for new supplies to arrive by wagon or train. Running out of liquor during a busy weekend could spell financial disaster. Then there were the long-term health effects nobody talked about. Bartenders breathed tobacco smoke all day, dealt with violent customers regularly, and rarely got decent sleep. Many developed drinking problems themselves. When you're surrounded by alcohol and stressed customers 16 hours a day, it's hard to resist joining them. But the toughest part might have been the emotional toll. Saloon workers saw humanity at its worst and best, sometimes in the same night. They witnessed celebrations, tragedies, violence and heartbreak on a daily basis. Some became cynical, others somehow maintained their sense of humor despite everything they'd seen. The most successful saloon operations ran like well-oiled machines, with each staff member knowing their role perfectly. But even the best-run establishments faced constant challenges that tested everyone's limits. However, the daily grind of running these establishments was nothing compared to the growing opposition they faced from an increasingly organized enemy. The Wild West wasn't just about cowboys and outlaws facing off in dusty streets. Behind the scenes, a completely different kind of battle was brewing. While men bellied up to bars for their daily shots of whiskey, another group was plotting to shut down every saloon from here to kingdom come. Religious leaders took one look at these watering holes and saw pure evil. They didn't mince words either. Preachers called saloons Satan's recruiting stations and highways to hell. Makes sense, right? From their perspective, everything wrong with frontier life seemed to flow out of those swinging doors: domestic violence, gambling debts, shootouts, broken families, you name it. And they blamed the bottle. The temperance movement started small but grew like wildfire across the West. Women led the charge, and boy were they organized. The Women's Christian Temperance Union became a force nobody expected. These ladies didn't just complain from their parlors, they marched right up to saloon doors with axes, hatchets, and righteous fury. Carrie Nation became the most famous saloon smasher of all time. This 6-foot-tall tornado of a woman would storm into Kansas bars shouting, "Men, I have come to save you from a drunkard's fate." Then she'd proceed to destroy everything in sight. Mirrors, bottles, chairs, tables, nothing survived her wrath. Saloon owners learned to fear her name more than any gunslinger. But the conflict ran deeper than just property damage. Churches and saloons represented two completely different visions of what frontier towns should become. Churches wanted civilized communities with proper families, Sunday services, and moral order. Saloons represented freedom, individual choice, and frankly, a whole lot more fun for the average working man. The battle for hearts and minds got pretty creative. Churches organized revival meetings right across the street from popular saloons. They'd sing hymns loud enough to drown out the piano music coming from the bars. Some preachers timed their most fire and brimstone sermons for Saturday nights, hoping to catch men before they headed out for drinks. Temperance groups printed propaganda that would make modern advertisers jealous. Posters showed weeping wives and starving children outside saloon doors. They created elaborate charts showing how much money families wasted on liquor versus necessities like food and clothing. One popular poster read, "The saloon is the sum of all villainies. It is worse than war or pestilence." Saloon owners fought back with their own arguments. They claimed bars provided essential social services that churches couldn't match. Where else could a lonely cowboy find companionship after months on the trail? What other businesses stayed open all night for shift workers? They argued that moderate drinking helped men relax after dangerous back-breaking work. The weird part is how often these two worlds overlapped. Some of the most vocal temperance supporters had husbands who secretly frequented the very establishments they protested. Several famous preachers got caught sneaking into backroom card games. Human nature, it turns out, was more complicated than either side wanted to admit. Then there were the economic realities nobody wanted to discuss openly. Saloons generated enormous tax revenue for cash-strapped frontier towns. A single busy bar might pay more in licenses and fines than a dozen other businesses combined. Town councils found themselves in the awkward position of publicly supporting temperance while privately counting saloon money. Some communities tried compromise solutions that pleased exactly nobody. Blue laws restricted saloon hours on Sundays. Dry zones around churches and schools created weird maps where you could drink on one side of the street but not the other. Local option laws let individual counties vote themselves dry while neighboring areas stayed wet. The divide split families and friendships down the middle. Brothers stopped speaking over the issue. Business partnerships dissolved. Church congregations fractured when members disagreed about how aggressively to pursue prohibition. Even marriages suffered when spouses took opposite sides. Violence occasionally erupted beyond Carrie Nation's theatrical bar smashing. Temperance rallies turned into riots when saloon supporters showed up drunk and belligerent. Some churches received death threats. A few particularly hated saloon owners found their buildings mysteriously burned down after heated town meetings. What made the conflict especially bitter was that both sides genuinely believed they were saving civilization. Churches saw alcohol destroying families and corrupting society's moral foundation. Saloon supporters viewed prohibition as government overreach that threatened individual liberty. Neither side was entirely wrong, which made compromise nearly impossible. The temperance movement's political power grew stronger every year. They organized voter registration drives, endorsed candidates, and lobbied territorial legislatures. What started as moral outrage gradually transformed into sophisticated political machinery that would eventually achieve nationwide prohibition. Meanwhile, saloon culture was evolving too, though reformers rarely acknowledged the changes. Many establishments cleaned up their acts, banned gambling, and hired more respectable entertainment. Some owners genuinely tried to create family-friendly environments, though families rarely took them up on the offer. This epic struggle between salvation and spirits would ultimately reshape American drinking culture forever. But before we see how that played out, there's another surprising group caught in the middle of this war. Most saloons had one rule that was absolutely sacred: no kids allowed, period. End of discussion. These weren't places for children, and everyone knew it. The atmosphere reeked of tobacco, cheap whiskey, and questionable life choices. But here's the thing about frontier life: rules had a funny way of bending when survival was on the line. Children found ways to orbit around saloons like moths around a flame. They couldn't get inside, but they sure could make a living off the chaos that spilled out. Smart kids positioned themselves right outside the swinging doors, ready to run errands for a nickel or two. "Hey boy, get me a bucket of water from the well," some drunk cowboy would holler. Off the kid would sprint, hoping to earn enough coins for a meal. Delivery work became a goldmine for entrepreneurial youngsters. Saloons needed ice hauled in during summer months. They needed firewood stacked. They needed messages carried to other businesses or to the telegraph office. Some kids even got hired to sweep the wooden sidewalks outside, cleaning up the mess from last night's brawls. The saloon owners didn't mind paying a few cents for these services. It kept the riffraff kids busy and out of real trouble. Then there were the more creative hustlers. Boys would hang around outside with shoeshine kits, knowing that gamblers liked to look sharp before heading inside for a big game. Others sold newspapers or penny candy to customers waiting their turn to get into packed saloons on busy nights. A few enterprising kids even set up little stands selling jerky or hard-boiled eggs to hungry drinkers who stumbled out looking for food. But the real excitement happened when saloon fights exploded onto the street. Kids would scatter like startled chickens when fists started flying and chairs came crashing through windows. These brawls were like free entertainment, better than any traveling circus. Of course, parents tried their best to keep children away when trouble started brewing, but curious young minds have a way of finding the action anyway. Older teenagers presented a different problem entirely. 16 and 17-year-olds thought they were tough enough to handle saloon life. They'd try sneaking in through back doors or during busy Saturday nights when the bartender might not notice an extra face in the crowd. Most got caught and thrown out faster than they could order a drink. Some persistent ones would peek through windows, trying to watch poker games or catch glimpses of the fancy dancers everyone whispered about. Well, not every interaction between kids and saloons was innocent business. Some children had fathers who spent way too much time and money inside those swinging doors. These kids would get sent by desperate mothers to drag daddy home before he gambled away the grocery money. Picture a 10-year-old standing outside the Oriental Saloon, trying to work up the courage to march inside and fetch his father. It took guts most adults didn't have. Saloon owners generally tried to keep things family-friendly on the outside, even if the inside was pure chaos. They knew that angry wives and concerned church folks were already watching their every move. The last thing they needed was a reputation for corrupting innocent children. Most bartenders would shoo kids away from the entrance, sometimes offering them a penny just to go play somewhere else. And the weird part is, some saloons actually served as unofficial babysitting services during emergencies. If a mother needed to rush to help with a difficult birth or tend to a sick neighbor, she might leave her children with strict instructions to wait outside the saloon where their father worked. The bartender would keep one eye on the kids through the window, making sure they stayed safe while staying far away from the adult activities inside. Winter months created special challenges in colder territories. Kids delivering supplies to saloons had to navigate icy streets and snowdrifts. But the pay was often better during harsh weather, since saloon owners needed extra help hauling coal for heating and clearing snow from their entrances. Smart children learned that stormy nights meant more tips from grateful customers who didn't want to venture outside themselves. The relationship between saloons and children revealed something important about frontier communities. Even in the roughest, most lawless towns, people tried to draw some lines between adult vices and childhood innocence. Makes sense, right? These weren't monsters running these establishments. They were people trying to make a living in tough times, and most had families of their own back home. However, this careful balance between keeping kids safe and letting them earn money around saloons was about to face its biggest test. The entertainment business was expanding rapidly in these establishments, and some of those new attractions would blur the lines even further about what children should and shouldn't witness in the Wild West. Wild West saloons weren't just places to drink rock-gut whiskey and start fights. They doubled as the frontier's entertainment centers, bringing a taste of show business to dusty cowtowns and mining camps. Makes sense, right? People working hard all day needed more than just alcohol to forget their troubles. Piano players were the backbone of saloon entertainment. These musicians could bang out everything from waltz tunes to rowdy drinking songs. The catch? Most frontier pianos had seen better days. Keys stuck, strings snapped, and the instruments went out of tune faster than a cowboy could draw his gun. But nobody seemed to care much. A piano player who could keep the music going despite a busted middle C was worth his weight in gold nuggets. Singers followed closely behind pianists in popularity. Female vocalists drew the biggest crowds, though finding talented women willing to perform in rough saloons wasn't easy. These performers had to be tough enough to handle drunk hecklers while skilled enough to keep audiences entertained. Many came from back east, lured by promises of good money and adventure. What they found was often harder work than they'd bargained for. Then there were the dancers. Not the refined ballet type you'd see in fancy city theaters, but women who could kick up their heels to lively tunes. Can-can dancers became especially popular after word spread about Parisian-style performances. Of course, frontier versions looked pretty different from the original French shows. Dusty saloon floors and cramped spaces made for some interesting adaptations. Card tricks and magic acts filled the gaps between musical performances. Traveling magicians discovered that saloon crowds made perfect audiences. These men had seen everything from Indian attacks to claim jumpers, but a good sleight of hand trick could still amaze them. Smart performers learned to work the room, moving from table to table with card tricks or coin illusions. Tips flowed freely when the whiskey was flowing too. But here's where things got tricky. Entertainment meant competition between saloons. Bar owners constantly searched for acts that would pull customers away from rival establishments. This led to some pretty creative booking decisions. One saloon might hire a banjo player and a dancing dog. Another would counter with twin singers, and a man who could juggle bottles while standing on one foot. The weird part is how some shows got completely out of hand. Audiences fueled by cheap alcohol didn't always appreciate subtle entertainment. Performers quickly learned to read the room. A crowd of tired miners might want gentle music, but a group of celebrating cowboys could turn violent if the show seemed too tame. Smart entertainers kept backup songs ready, something livelier if the crowd grew restless. Let's not forget the practical challenges these performers faced. Saloon stages were often just cleared floor space near the piano. Lighting came from oil lamps or candles, creating dramatic shadows but making it hard to see the audience clearly. And the smell? Well, combine unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and spilled alcohol, and you get an atmosphere that could knock you over. Money motivated most of the entertainment bookings. Saloon owners discovered that good shows kept customers drinking longer and spending more. A piano player might earn his keep just by extending the average customer's visit by an hour, but the real money came from special events. A traveling troupe announcing a one-night-only performance could pack a saloon beyond its normal capacity. Some saloons developed regular entertainment schedules. Friday and Saturday nights featured live music, while weekday evenings might offer card demonstrations or storytelling. This gave customers something to look forward to, and helped establish loyalty to particular establishments. Word spread quickly in small frontier towns when a saloon booked exceptional talent. Competition for performers got fierce in bigger towns with multiple saloons. Denver, for instance, had nearly 500 drinking establishments by the 1890s. Entertainment became a key differentiator. Some saloons hired full-time musicians while others rotated acts weekly. A few even built small stages and invested in better lighting to attract touring performers. The strangest acts often drew the biggest crowds. One Montana saloon featured a man who could play harmonica while gargling whiskey. Another hired a woman who told fortunes between dance numbers. Customers never knew what they might encounter, which added to the excitement of saloon visits. Weather affected entertainment schedules too. Winter months saw more elaborate shows since people spent longer periods indoors. Summer entertainment often moved outside, with saloons hosting impromptu street performances to attract passers-by. These outdoor shows sometimes drew families and children, though most parents kept their distance from actual saloon grounds. Professional entertainers faced unique dangers in saloon work. Drunk patrons sometimes took performances too personally, leading to confrontations. Female performers especially had to navigate unwanted attention while maintaining their stage presence. Many carried small weapons or relied on bartenders and bouncers for protection. The show business side of saloons created an entire economy of traveling performers who followed boom towns and cattle drives. These entertainers knew that a good night in a prosperous mining camp could fund weeks of travel to the next opportunity. But not every performance went smoothly, and even the most talented acts had to deal with rowdy audiences and unpredictable working conditions that would challenge any performer's skills. Walking into most Western saloons was like entering a world where hygiene took a permanent vacation. The smell hit you first, a toxic blend of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, tobacco juice, and something that might have been food but could just as easily have been last week's laundry. These weren't exactly the sparkling establishments you'd want your mother to visit. Spittoons lined the floors like bronze sentries, though their effectiveness was questionable at best. Cowboys and miners aimed for them with varying degrees of success, creating sticky dark stains that spread across wooden planks like abstract art nobody wanted to see. The floors themselves told stories of 1,000 spilled drinks, muddy boots, and the occasional brawl that ended with someone face down in the sawdust. Speaking of sawdust, saloon owners scattered it everywhere like fairy dust, if fairies specialized in absorbing tobacco juice and vomit. Fresh sawdust meant a somewhat civilized establishment. Old soggy sawdust that squished underfoot. You were in one of those places where standards had packed up and left town long ago. Smart owners changed their sawdust weekly, others seemed to think it aged like fine wine. The bar itself became a showcase of questionable cleanliness. Glasses got a quick rinse in whatever water was handy, sometimes clean, often not. Bar rags had seen more action than a cavalry horse, wiping down surfaces, cleaning glasses, and occasionally serving as emergency bandages. The same rag might clean a spittoon and polish a glass within minutes. Food safety wasn't exactly a pressing concern in 1870s Montana. Dishwashing presented its own special challenges. Most saloons had one large tub of water that served multiple purposes throughout the day. Morning brought relatively clean water. By evening, that same tub resembled something you'd find in a swamp. Soap was expensive and considered optional by many establishments. Hot water, that was for fancy places with actual budgets. Then there were the uninvited guests. Rats, mice, and insects that treated saloons like all-you-can-eat buffets. Rats scurried between beer barrels and gnawed through grain sacks. Flies buzzed around sticky surfaces and landed on everything edible. Cockroaches made themselves at home in dark corners, emerging at night like tiny unwanted customers who never paid their tabs. Some saloon owners actually cared about cleanliness, but they faced constant battles against the elements. Dust storms turned clean establishments into sandboxes overnight. Rain created mud that tracked through doors on dozens of boots daily. Winter meant customers couldn't bathe for months, turning even the cleanest saloon into a test of human endurance. The fancier establishments tried harder, hiring staff specifically to maintain standards. These places might actually wash glasses properly, change sawdust regularly, and keep rats at bay with cats who earned their keep. Mirrors got polished, brass footrails gleamed, and spittoons received actual attention. But even these upscale saloons would horrify modern health inspectors. Laundry presented another challenge entirely. Bar towels, if they got washed at all, might go weeks between cleanings. Aprons worn by bartenders told stories of every spill, every wiped hand, every messy encounter from the past month. Personal hygiene among staff varied wildly, depending on the owner's standards and the availability of clean water. Storage areas became breeding grounds for problems. Beer barrels sat in dark corners where cleaning was forgotten. Whiskey bottles gathered dust and attracted insects. Food supplies, when they existed, competed with rodents for space. Some saloons stored grain for horses right next to human food, creating interesting mixtures of flavors and problems. The weird part is that customers seemed to accept all this as normal frontier life. Clean alternatives didn't exist in most towns anyway. Hotels weren't much cleaner, restaurants were scarce, and camping outdoors presented its own hygiene challenges. Saloons represented civilization, even if that civilization smelled like a barn and looked worse. Winter made everything harder. Frozen water meant less cleaning. Closed windows trapped smells inside. Customers wore the same clothes for months, adding layers of dirt and odor to spaces already struggling with cleanliness. Some saloons became so rank that even hardened cowboys complained, which really meant something. Smart saloon owners learned that basic cleanliness could set them apart from competition. Word spread quickly about places that were too dirty even for miners who lived underground. A reputation for cleanliness, or the complete lack thereof, could make or break a business faster than bad whiskey or crooked gambling. But here's what's fascinating. Despite all these hygiene horrors, Saloons remained social centers where communities gathered, business got conducted, and friendships formed. People overlooked the dirt and smell because these places provided something more important: human connection in isolated frontier towns. Of course, cleanliness wasn't the only thing that varied wildly between different regions and states across the expanding West. When we talk about Western saloons, most folks picture one dusty main street with a single swinging door establishment. Reality tells a completely different story. By the late 1800s, entire states were absolutely drowning in saloons. Texas led the charge with numbers that would make your head spin. The Lone Star State boasted over 2,000 licensed saloons by 1885. That's roughly one saloon for every 800 people, including women and children, who weren't even allowed inside most of them. Makes sense, right? Cowboys needed somewhere to blow their wages after months on the trail. Montana wasn't far behind in the saloon arms race. Helena alone had 150 saloons serving a population of just 14,000 people. Walk 3 blocks in any direction, and you'd pass at least 5 different watering holes. Some streets had saloons facing each other like gunfighters at high noon. But here's where things get really wild. Denver, Colorado started the 1860s with around 30 saloons. 30 years later, nearly 500 establishments were pouring drinks legally, with probably twice as many operating without proper licenses. The city's population had exploded from 5,000 to 107,000, but the saloon growth far outpaced even that massive boom. California's numbers were absolutely staggering during the gold rush years. San Francisco went from 0 saloons to over 3,000 in less than 2 decades. Some mining camps had more bars than houses. Hangtown, later renamed Placerville, had 47 saloons for fewer than 800 residents. The weird part is, most of these places stayed packed from dawn until well past midnight. Geography played a huge role in how these establishments looked and operated. Mountain State saloons in Colorado and Montana resembled rustic hunting lodges. Thick log walls kept out brutal winter winds. Stone fireplaces dominated entire walls. These places served hot whiskey toddies and steaming coffee laced with bourbon to warm frozen miners and trappers. Desert state saloons looked completely different. Arizona and Nevada establishments featured thick adobe walls and small windows to keep out scorching heat. Many stayed partially underground during summer months. Drinks were served at room temperature because ice cost more than gold in some remote locations. Texas saloons reflected the state's cattle culture. Many featured hitching posts for 20 or more horses. Wide front porches provided shade for cowboys who wanted to drink outside. Some establishments doubled as informal livestock trading posts where ranchers made deals over shots of rye whiskey. Let's not forget the climate influenced what people drank too. Northern states like Montana and Wyoming saw huge demand for warming spirits during brutal winters. Brandy, rum, and hot toddies outsold beer when temperatures dropped below freezing. Some states preferred lighter drinks during sweltering summers, though light still meant alcohol strong enough to strip paint. The speed of saloon expansion often outpaced law enforcement entirely. Many frontier regions got their first saloons years before their first schools, churches, or official courthouses. Saloon owners essentially served as unofficial mayors, judges, and community leaders. They settled disputes, held town meetings, and sometimes even performed wedding ceremonies after particularly successful poker games. Competition between states became fierce as word spread about profitable saloon territories. Professional gamblers and experienced bartenders migrated like birds following seasonal opportunities. A successful saloon owner in Texas might hear about a Colorado silver strike and pack up his entire operation within weeks. Different states developed their own unique saloon cultures based on who settled there first. German immigrants brought beer halls to Wisconsin and Minnesota. Irish settlers in Boston created establishments focused on whiskey and political discussions. Mexican influence in southwestern states introduced tequila and pulque to frontier drinking menus. The sheer volume of alcohol consumption in some states reached epidemic proportions. Kansas, before it went dry, had over 1,500 saloons serving a population smaller than modern-day Wichita. Some towns reported that alcohol-related businesses generated more tax revenue than all other industries combined. Railroad expansion accelerated saloon growth exponentially across state lines. Every new rail stop needed at least one saloon to serve construction crews, passengers, and freight handlers. Railroad companies sometimes invested directly in saloon construction, knowing these establishments would generate steady business for their transportation services. State governments eventually realized saloons represented massive untapped tax revenue. Licensing fees jumped from a few dollars to hundreds of dollars annually in major cities. Some states collected more money from saloon licenses than from property taxes during peak frontier years. Then there is the matter of interstate saloon chains. Successful owners started opening multiple locations across state boundaries. The famous gambling family who ran saloons from Texas to Montana essentially created America's first bar franchise system decades before anyone used that term. Regional differences meant traveling salesmen needed completely different approaches depending on which state they entered. What worked in a rowdy Colorado mining camp could get you thrown out of a more refined California establishment. Each state developed its own unwritten rules about proper saloon behavior, but understanding how different states handled their saloon boom only tells part of the story. The real question becomes what happened when the party finally ended. By 1920, something extraordinary happened that changed American drinking forever. The 18th Amendment kicked in, and suddenly every saloon in the country became illegal overnight. After nearly a century of Wild West drinking culture, the hammer came down hard. The timing couldn't have been more dramatic. Just when saloons had evolved from rough frontier shacks into established businesses, Prohibition wiped them all out. Well, the legal ones anyway. What's fascinating is how quickly everything changed. One day you could walk into your local saloon for a whiskey and a poker game. The next day that same building had to find a completely different purpose or risk getting raided by federal agents. Most saloon owners saw the writing on the wall months before Prohibition officially started, but many held out hope that somehow the law wouldn't stick. They were wrong. The word saloon itself became toxic almost immediately. Nobody wanted to be associated with something that was now federally banned. Owners who managed to stay in business had to completely rebrand themselves. They became cafes, social clubs, or restaurants. The swinging doors disappeared. The brass spittoons got tossed out. Even the long wooden bars that defined saloon culture were often removed or covered up. But here's where it gets interesting. The death of legal saloons didn't kill the demand for alcohol. It just pushed everything underground. Speakeasies popped up everywhere, but they operated in a completely different world than the old frontier saloons. Instead of being the town's social center where everyone gathered openly, drinking became secretive and dangerous. Former saloon owners faced tough choices. Some went completely legitimate and actually did become restaurant owners or opened ice cream parlors. Others couldn't resist the money in illegal booze and became bootleggers or speakeasy operators. The skills were transferable, but the risks were much higher. Let's not forget the geography factor here. Rural saloons got hit especially hard because they couldn't hide as easily as city establishments. In small frontier towns where the saloon had been the main gathering place, entire social structures collapsed. Towns that had grown up around mining camps or cattle trails suddenly lost their central meeting spot. The enforcement varied wildly depending on where you lived. Some sheriffs looked the other way, especially in areas where saloons had deep community roots. Others embraced their new role as prohibition agents and shut down every hint of illegal drinking. This created a patchwork of enforcement that made the transition even more chaotic. What's really striking is how different the underground drinking scene became compared to the old saloon culture. Saloons had been rough, sure, but they were also democratic. Rich or poor, cowboy or businessman. Everyone drank the same rock-gut whiskey standing at the same bar. Speakeasies often catered to specific social classes and operated with much more exclusivity. The entertainment changed too. Saloon piano players and dance hall girls were replaced by jazz musicians and flappers. The whole atmosphere shifted from frontier rough and tumble to urban sophistication even in underground establishments. Then there's the economic impact nobody talks about. Thousands of bartenders, barmaids, musicians and other saloon workers suddenly found themselves unemployed. These weren't just jobs that disappeared temporarily, they were entire career paths that got wiped out. Many of these workers had specialized skills that didn't translate well to other industries. Some entrepreneurs got creative with workarounds. They opened near-beer establishments that served low-alcohol beverages or medicine shops that sold alcohol for supposedly therapeutic purposes. Others pivoted to ice cream parlors or soda fountains, trying to capture some of the social atmosphere that saloons had provided. The speed of change was breathtaking. In towns like Denver, which had nearly 500 saloons by the late 1800s, almost all of them closed within months of Prohibition starting. Buildings that had housed decades of drinking, gambling, and frontier socializing suddenly stood empty or got converted to completely different uses. What makes this transformation even more remarkable is that it happened during a time when many frontier communities were still relatively isolated. News traveled slowly, but federal law moved fast. Remote mining towns that might not hear about national politics for weeks still had to comply with prohibition enforcement. The cultural shift went beyond just alcohol. Saloons had represented a certain kind of American independence and frontier spirit. Their sudden disappearance marked the end of that era just as clearly as the closing of the frontier itself. The days when a man could ride into town, tie up his horse, and drink openly with strangers from all walks of life were officially over. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, the world had moved on. The classic Western saloon never came back, even though alcohol became legal again. What emerged instead were modern bars and nightclubs that bore little resemblance to their frontier predecessors. But before we write off saloons as just another casualty of changing times, we should look at which specific towns managed to keep their saloon legends alive even after the buildings closed. Some towns became legendary, not for their gold mines or cattle ranches, but for their saloons. Dodge City, Deadwood, and Tombstone weren't just frontier settlements. They were drinking capitals of the American West, where more whiskey flowed than water, and every corner seemed to have another bar beckoning thirsty travelers. Dodge City earned its reputation as the wildest cowtown in Kansas, and saloons made it possible. The Long Branch Saloon became so famous that Hollywood still uses its name today. But here's what's fascinating. Dodge City had more saloons per person than almost anywhere else in America. With a population that barely reached 1,200 people at its peak, the town somehow supported over 20 drinking establishments. That's one saloon for every 60 residents, including women and children who couldn't even enter them. The math gets even stranger when you consider that most of these customers were seasonal. Cowboys only came to town after cattle drives, miners showed up when they struck pay dirt, and soldiers arrived between patrols. Yet saloon owners made enough money during these busy periods to stay open year-round. The Long Branch alone reportedly served over 500 customers on busy Saturday nights. Then there's Deadwood, South Dakota, where saloons outnumbered churches 15-1. The town exploded overnight when gold was discovered in 1876, and within months, nearly 40 saloons lined Main Street. The Notel and Mann's Saloon No. 10 became infamous as the place where Wild Bill Hickok was shot while playing poker. His killer, Jack McCall, had been drinking there for hours before pulling the trigger. That single incident turned a regular saloon into a tourist destination that people still visit today. What made Deadwood's saloons special wasn't just their number, but their around-the-clock operation. Unlike other towns that enforced closing hours, Deadwood saloons never shut their doors. Miners worked in shifts, so bars stayed open to serve whoever stumbled out of the hills with gold dust in their pockets. Some establishments went months without locking up, creating a bizarre economy where bartenders worked in rotating shifts and poker games lasted for days. Tombstone, Arizona, took saloon culture to another level entirely. The Oriental Saloon was so fancy that Eastern newspapers wrote about its crystal chandeliers and imported mirrors. But the town's real claim to fame came from the tension between saloon crowds and law enforcement. The famous gunfight near the OK Corral started with an argument that began in a saloon. The Clanton gang had been drinking and gambling for hours before their confrontation with the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday. These weren't isolated incidents. Tombstone averaged one saloon shooting per week during its peak years. The Birdcage Theater combined drinking with entertainment, but fights broke out so regularly that the building still has over 140 bullet holes in its walls. Visitors counted them. But here's where things get interesting. These towns actively promoted their saloon reputations. City councils in places like Dodge City and Tombstone realized that wild stories attracted more visitors and business. They printed pamphlets advertising their authentic Western experience and encouraged newspapers to write about saloon adventures. Some incidents were exaggerated or completely fabricated to draw more tourists and settlers. The competition between towns got ridiculous. When Dodge City claimed to be the wickedest little city in America, Deadwood countered by advertising itself as the place where law never reached. Tombstone went even further, printing wanted posters as souvenirs and encouraging staged gunfights outside popular saloons. Tourism based on saloon mythology started earlier than most people realize. Let's not forget that these famous saloon towns created their own economic ecosystems. Successful bars attracted hotels, restaurants, and shops. Gambling halls opened next to popular saloons to catch overflow crowds. Even legitimate businesses like banks and general stores stayed open later to serve saloon customers who might wander out with money to spend. Some towns tried to recreate this success artificially. New settlements would build oversized saloons before they had enough population to support them, hoping to attract the kind of reputation that made Dodge City famous. Most failed spectacularly, leaving behind empty buildings and broken dreams. The strangest part is how these towns handled their dual identities. During the day, many operated as normal frontier communities with schools, churches, and family businesses, but after sunset, they transformed into the wild places that legends were made of. Respectable citizens often left town on weekends to avoid the chaos, returning when things calmed down. Today, these former saloon capitals make millions from their reputations. Dodge City, Deadwood, and Tombstone have turned their bars into museums, their shootout sites into tourist attractions, and their wild histories into carefully managed brands. The very chaos that once threatened to destroy them now pays their bills. What's remarkable is how Hollywood's version of these places shaped what actually happened in them. But the real story of how movies changed our view of saloon culture reveals something even more surprising about American mythology. Hollywood convinced us that every saloon had swinging doors, piano music, and daily shootouts. Walk into any Western movie set, and you'll see the same thing. Polished wood bars, perfectly dressed bartenders, and gunfighters who never miss their target. But here's the kicker, most of that stuff never happened. Real saloons didn't have swinging doors everywhere. Those famous batwing doors, they were actually pretty rare. Most saloons had regular doors, or sometimes no doors at all. The swinging door thing started because movie studios thought it looked cooler. Makes sense, right? A cowboy bursting through swinging doors is way more dramatic than opening a regular door like everyone else. Then there's the whole shootout myth. Hollywood wants you to believe every saloon had multiple gunfights per week. The truth is way less exciting. Most saloon fights were just drunk guys throwing punches and falling over chairs. Actual gunfights inside saloons were incredibly rare. When they did happen, it was big news that people talked about for years. The weird part is how movies show saloon size. Those massive Hollywood saloons with chandeliers and grand staircases. Pure fantasy. Real frontier saloons were usually tiny, cramped spaces that smelled like unwashed bodies and stale beer. You couldn't fit a camera crew in most of them, let alone stage an elaborate fight scene. Let's not forget the famous quick-draw duels that supposedly happened outside every saloon. Professional historians have found records of maybe a dozen real quick-draw gunfights in the entire Wild West period. That's it. Compare that to the hundreds you've seen in movies and TV shows. Most real confrontations were messy, unorganized affairs where nobody looked particularly heroic. Movie saloons always have that perfectly positioned piano in the corner, with some lady in a fancy dress playing cheerful tunes. Real saloon music was way different. Most places couldn't afford a piano, and when they had one, it was usually beaten up and out of tune. Entertainment was more likely to be a guy with a harmonica, or maybe someone singing drunk songs that would make your grandmother blush. But why did Hollywood get it so wrong? Simple. Real saloons weren't glamorous enough for movies. Picture a small dark room with dirt floors, no windows, and the constant smell of tobacco spit. Not exactly the romantic Wild West that sells movie tickets. Studio executives knew audiences wanted adventure and excitement, not historical accuracy. The clothing in Western movies is another dead giveaway. Everyone's dressed like they just visited the costume shop. Real cowboys and miners wore whatever cheap clothes they could find. Most looked more like homeless drifters than the clean-shaven heroes Hollywood loves. Their clothes were dirty, patched, and often falling apart. Movie saloons also show way too much variety in drinks. Film bartenders are always mixing fancy cocktails or serving crystal clear whiskey from beautiful bottles. Real saloon alcohol came from barrels and jugs. The whiskey was brown, cloudy, and tasted like it could strip paint. No fancy mixing required. You got what you got and hoped it wouldn't blind you. Then there's the myth of the honorable gunfighter. Movies love showing noble outlaws who only shot bad guys and always gave fair warning. Real outlaws were usually just criminals looking for easy money. They weren't particularly skilled with guns, and they definitely weren't interested in fair fights. Most were cowards who ran at the first sign of real trouble. Hollywood saloons are always perfectly lit with warm golden light streaming through clean windows. Actual saloons were dark, gloomy places. Candles and oil lamps provided weak lighting that created more shadows than illumination. Many had no windows at all because glass was expensive and easily broken. The movie version of saloon gambling is particularly ridiculous. Everyone's playing poker like professional card sharks, throwing around huge amounts of money. Real saloon gambling was usually small stakes between broke men hoping to win enough for their next drink. The dramatic all-in moments were pretty rare when most guys only had a few dollars to their name. Western films also love showing saloons as the center of every important conversation and business deal. While saloons were social centers, most serious business happened elsewhere. Banks, general stores, and private homes were where real decisions got made. Saloons were mainly just places to drink and waste time. The truth about saloons is actually more interesting than Hollywood's version, just in different ways. Real saloons tell us about genuine American history, the struggles, poverty, and harsh realities of frontier life. But movies needed heroes and villains, not historical accuracy. Understanding what saloons were really like helps us appreciate how these rough establishments actually shaped American culture and memory. The stories might be less dramatic than Hollywood suggests, but they're far more revealing about who we really were. The cowboy hat hanging on a museum wall, the swinging doors creaking in an old movie, the dusty bottle of whiskey behind glass at a tourist trap. These images flood our minds when someone mentions the Wild West saloon, but they tell us something fascinating about America itself. We've turned these rough, often dangerous drinking holes into symbols of adventure and freedom. Country singers croon about honky-tonks and Saturday night saloons. Romance novels paint them as places where rugged heroes swept ladies off their feet. Theme restaurants across America slap fake swinging doors on their entrances and call it authentic Western atmosphere. But here's the weird part. Most Americans have never actually seen a real frontier saloon. What we think we know comes from Hollywood westerns, where every bar fight ends with someone crashing through those famous swinging doors. The truth is, many real saloons didn't even have swinging doors. They had regular doors, or sometimes no doors at all. The transformation of the saloon from reality to legend started almost immediately after Prohibition ended them. By the 1930s, Western movies were already romanticizing what had been, in many cases, pretty grim places. Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows had been touring for decades, turning frontier life into entertainment. Suddenly the smelly, dangerous saloon where men drank rot-gut whiskey became the charming watering hole where noble cowboys discussed cattle drives over quality bourbon. Tourism jumped on this bandwagon faster than a horse thief fleeing a posse. Towns like Tombstone, Arizona, and Deadwood, South Dakota, discovered that their violent past could become profitable present. Former saloon buildings, many of which had been abandoned or converted to other uses, suddenly became prime real estate. Some got restored, others got completely rebuilt to match what tourists expected them to look like. The result, walking through historic saloons today often means experiencing something that never really existed. Those perfectly polished bars with their gleaming brass fixtures. Most frontier saloons had rough wooden planks and maybe a cracked mirror. The elaborate gaming tables with their felt surfaces and fancy chips. Real frontier gambling often happened on barrels or crates with whatever coins or nuggets men had in their pockets. Then there's the language that stuck around. Modern bartenders still work behind the bar. We still belly up to order drinks. Happy hour specials get called 2-for-1 shots, echoing the days when saloon customers literally downed shots of whiskey. Sports bars have bar rails where customers can rest their feet, just like those brass footrails in fancy frontier establishments. Ghost stories keep the saloon legend alive in unexpected ways. Paranormal investigators regularly visit old saloon buildings, claiming to hear phantom piano music or the clink of ghostly glasses. Whether you believe in spirits or not, these stories show how deeply saloons have embedded themselves in our cultural imagination. We want these places to still be alive somehow. Country music deserves special mention here. Songs about saloons, honky-tonks, and roadhouses fill the airwaves. Singers like Hank Williams Jr. and George Strait made careers partly by singing about bars that sound suspiciously like romanticized Wild West saloons. The modern country bar, with its mechanical bull and cowboy hats, owes more to frontier saloon mythology than to actual Western history. All Wild West reenactments have become big business too. People spend hundreds of dollars on authentic-looking costumes to attend events where they can pretend to be cowboys and saloon girls. These gatherings often center around recreated saloons, complete with period-appropriate or period-appropriate-looking drinks and entertainment. Participants take it seriously, researching historical details and arguing over whether their revolver matches the correct time period. Corporate America caught on quickly. Chain restaurants with Western themes multiply across the country, all featuring some version of the classic saloon aesthetic. Longhorn Steakhouse, Texas Roadhouse, and dozens of local establishments use saloon imagery to sell everything from burgers to margaritas. The actual connection to frontier history, pretty much non-existent, but maybe that's not entirely bad. The saloon in American memory represents something we still crave, a place where people gathered, where social rules relaxed a bit, where ordinary folks could rub shoulders with colorful characters. Modern sports bars, neighborhood pubs and corner taverns serve similar social functions, just with better hygiene and fewer gunfights. The staying power of saloon imagery reveals something about American character. We romanticize the frontier because it represents a time when individuals could seemingly make their own rules and carve out their own destinies. The saloon becomes a symbol of that freedom, even though the reality was often much harsher. What's particularly interesting is how this mythology has spread beyond America's borders. People worldwide recognize the Wild West saloon as quintessentially American, but understanding how these places really operated, versus how we remember them, reveals important truths about frontier life that romantic legends often obscure. What happens when a piece of history becomes bigger than the truth? Saloons didn't just disappear after Prohibition. They transformed into something much more powerful, a legend. And like most legends, the real story got buried under layers of Hollywood magic and nostalgic storytelling. The actual legacy of Western saloons runs deeper than shootouts and swinging doors. These rough establishments fundamentally changed how Americans thought about social spaces. Before saloons, frontier communities had few places where strangers could gather, conduct business, or blow off steam. Saloons filled that gap. They became the unofficial headquarters for everything from cattle deals to political arguments. But here's what most people miss. Saloons taught America how to mix business with pleasure. Modern sports bars, hotel lounges, and even networking events all trace their DNA back to those dusty frontier watering holes. The idea that you could close a deal over drinks, that started in saloons. The concept of entertainment mixed with alcohol service. Saloons pioneered it. Well, they also established some darker patterns. The close connection between gambling, drinking, and questionable business deals didn't vanish with Prohibition. It just moved to different venues. Backroom deals in restaurants, casino culture, and the whole "what happens here stays here" mentality. All of that has saloon fingerprints on it. Then there's the economic impact that nobody talks about. Saloons were among the first businesses to prove that vice could be incredibly profitable. A single successful saloon could generate more tax revenue for a frontier town than 10 general stores combined. Local governments learned to depend on sin taxes from alcohol sales. That financial model never really went away. It just shifted to state lotteries, casinos, and cigarette taxes. The weird part is how saloons shaped American ideas about masculinity. These weren't just drinking establishments. They were theaters where men performed toughness, independence, and frontier swagger. The saloon regular became an American archetype. The guy who could handle his liquor, play cards without flinching, and settle disputes with either words or fists. And the bizarre truth: most real saloon patrons were nothing like the characters in Western movies. They were tired workers, lonely travelers, and small-town businessmen looking for conversation after long days. The gunfighting gamblers and quick-draw artists existed, sure, but they were rare exceptions. Most saloon drama involved arguments over card games or complaints about watered-down whiskey. Let's not forget how saloons influenced American architecture. Those long wooden bars, brass footrails, and large mirrors became standard features in drinking establishments nationwide. Even today's upscale cocktail lounges often include design elements that originated in frontier saloons. The idea that a bar should be a dramatic focal point, that's pure saloon thinking. But perhaps the strangest legacy is linguistic. Saloon slang infected American English permanently. Terms like belly up to the bar, last call, liquid courage, and drowning your sorrows all emerged from saloon culture. The phrase watering hole originally described actual water sources for cattle, but saloons adopted it as a nickname that stuck. Modern Americans still romanticize saloon life because it represents something we've largely lost: spaces where social rules were relaxed and anything could happen. Today's world is heavily regulated, sanitized, and predictable. Saloons represented chaos and possibility. They were dangerous, but that danger felt exciting rather than threatening. The entertainment industry keeps the saloon myth alive because it's perfect shorthand for American freedom and rebellion. Every Western movie needs a saloon scene because audiences expect it. It's become as essential to the genre as horses and cowboy hats. The swinging doors, the piano player, the inevitable bar fight. These elements feel more real to most people than actual historical facts about saloons. What's really fascinating is how different regions remember saloons differently. In the Southwest, they're remembered as multicultural gathering places where cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, and Native Americans sometimes drank together. In Montana and Wyoming, saloon stories focus more on mining culture and territorial disputes. Each region's saloon mythology reflects local values and historical experiences. The cautionary side of saloon legacy can't be ignored either. These establishments normalized heavy drinking, normalized violence as conflict resolution, and created environments where exploitation was common. Women, minorities, and young men often faced danger in saloon culture. The romantic version of saloon life glosses over these darker realities. Modern craft breweries and whiskey distilleries deliberately invoke saloon imagery in their marketing. They want customers to feel connected to that frontier independence and authenticity. It's brilliant business psychology, selling rebellion and adventure along with alcohol. The true legacy isn't found in Hollywood westerns or tourist attractions. It's embedded in how Americans still think about social drinking, business networking, and entertainment. Saloons taught us that gathering places could be profitable, exciting, and slightly dangerous all at once. Today's bars, clubs, and pubs are saloon descendants, just with better hygiene and stricter laws. The fundamental appeal remains unchanged. Places where strangers become temporary friends and ordinary people feel part of something bigger than themselves. Saloons captured the American spirit at its most raw and hopeful, creating legends that outlasted the buildings themselves.